Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being patient. We ran just a little bit over on our closed session. Madam Clerk.
Report of closed session. Conference with legal counsel, anticipated litigation, significant exposure to litigation, one case, pursuant to Government Code Section 54956.9D2. No reportable action was taken. Item 2, public employee performance evaluation, Government Code Section 54957B1, title, Public Works Director. No reportable action was taken. Item 25, Community Development Block Grant. 1, conduct a public hearing for the purpose of soliciting citizens' views regarding the potential submission of a special wildlife disaster recovery community development block grant application in the amount of $2,808,000 for tree removal, watershed restoration, tree planting, and road repairs within the Butte Fire disaster area, and to adopt a resolution authorizing the Director of Health and Human Services or designee to submit the application to the state.
Thank you, Madam Clerk.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the board.
May I interrupt you for a moment? We're going to open the public hearing.
Oh, sorry.
You're going.
Sorry, a little too quick. Kristen Brinks, Health and Human Services Agency. Terry Cox is with me of Cox Consulting, who will be conducting conducting the public hearing on our behalf.
Good afternoon, Terry Cox, Cox Consulting. Now, what you have before you is a new variation on the Community Development Block Grant Program. Now, I know some of you are familiar with the program, some may not be. This is a pass-through from HUD to the State Department of Housing and Community Development. They do have an annual offering of, it's about $25 million a year at the moment. For which cities and counties that are smaller, in the case of a county it's less than 200,000, in the case of a city it's less than 50,000 in population, those entities can compete for funds in an array of activities like housing and public works, community facilities, public services, economic development, and planning. So every once in a while they have an unusual notice of funding availability, a NOFA. And in the case of the application before you, this NOFA was specifically to address the fires in Lake and Calaveras County. So there was a set aside of funds just for these two counties. It was $10 million, and it was split between the two jurisdictions based on the number of residences that burned in each place. So the amount that is requested in this grant application, the $2.8 million, is the set aside for Calaveras County based on that arithmetic. So working with your Public Works Director and actually a number of other staff members from the county, we went back and forth with the state from the point at which this NOFA was released, which was nearly a year ago, trying to find a project that the county needed that worked within the criteria that the state set forth. So what turned out to be eligible was to augment activities that the county is already doing with other funding sources like FEMA. So working on the watershed restoration, on removal of dead trees, but in this case, this is on private property rather than public property or property adjacent to public infrastructure like the money that you had from FEMA. So it's filling in that gap. We will be able to do a minor amount of county road repair, which the state doesn't particularly like, but is an eligible activity. And we will do tree planting to augment the watershed restoration. So all of these activities are similar to what you're already doing. It augments the funds that you have and will allow you to work on private property where you're not currently allowed to do that. Now, the administration of the program is sort of a work in progress. This is an unusual program for the state, so they don't really have a template for exactly what they expect, which is part of the reason why it took us so long to get a type of project that they would approve. But we will work out the details of the administration with the state once an award is made. So I think the breakdown of funds that you have in your staff memo, it's roughly 40% for tree removal, or $1,038,960 for watershed restoration. It's about 25%, which is $649,350. Same for tree planting. Road repair is $259,740, and then the remainder is administration at $210,600. So with that, it's estimated that you'll be able to remove at least 700 fire-killed trees, and these are all going to be within 300 feet of residences. So it's going to be focused specifically on ones that present a hazard to residential property. Anticipating approximately 3 trees per household, that'd be 233 households. You will be able to do 200 acres of damaged watershed using mulching and hydroseeding at a maximum of 5,000 per property. That's 114 properties. 1,000 trees planted to go along with the watershed activity, and then will be a small number of roads that they will be able to address, thinking specifically of ones that need to be repaired in order to get into do the other activities, or ones that are damaged by the activities that you're proposing, or for roads that have no other public access. So I'm happy to answer any questions that I can.
Questions? Supervisor Garamendi.
Terry, thank you so much for working on this grant, and thanks for all the Public Works and HHS for working on it too. I know that this was a very special grant, and there was some real gymnastics to try to figure out how everything fit together. I know it's not, I want to make sure that it doesn't, as far as I remember, it won't impact all the burn area, but rather a specific census tract that we were able to figure out how to put into this package. Is that?
Actually, we were able to get the state to give on that item.
Great.
So we will be able to work generally within the entire disaster area.
Great. And we also spoke about possibly, once we move to the administrative phase and get to that, possibly a way to work with our RCD, Resource Conservation District, to help them with this meaty project as well.
Yeah.
They could help us with the work, and we could help them get their feet under themselves.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Sure. I do have a sign-in sheet, a voluntary sheet for anybody that's attending this public hearing.
Further questions or present?
So as this sheet goes around, if everybody could, if you are willing to sign it, please.
Yeah, anybody who would like to, it's optional.
I do have a question. Who's going to be administering this grant? Under what control? And what office?
Well, all of your community development block grant activities run through the Department of Health and Human Services.
Okay.
Now, of course, in a project like this, you would be working closely with your Public Works Director.
Okay. And Public Works is geared up to handle this type of operation?
Well,
amongst other things that they're handling?
yeah, like we discussed, the exact form of the administration you will be able to develop once you've got your award. And it's the county's option whether you want to hire staff, whether you want to hire a subrecipient like the RCD, a combination of the two. It's kind of up to you how you do it.
Okay, thank you. Further questions? Madam Clerk?
I just wanted to say, you're not required to sign that sign-in sheet. If you would like to sign it, you can. It is not required, just so you know.
Just say no.
Just say no if you don't want to.
Supervisor Mills.
I had to wave my wand.
Sorry.
Ms. Cox,
I'm a pumpkin.
We're getting giddy. That sugar must have really got to some people. Regarding the CDBGs, which we've had different types of those grants in the county over the years, is there a specific timeline that we have to complete these projects
The typical contract term for a community development block grant is about 2.5 years from the contract date. Now, this can vary somewhat depending on when they actually issue a contract. Sometimes the start date is 6 months before you actually get the contract, but figuring 2.5 years is the norm.
And some of them are to help with local matches, so to speak. I remember the Valencia Sewer Project where there was a CDBG that made up a local match for a project.
This does happen at times, yes.
And I just wanted to be sure that was on the table. Everybody understood there was a local match.
Not in this particular case.
Okay.
The only required match in state CDBG at the current time is for planning grants, and that's like 5% of whatever the request is. So this project has no local match required.
And we will have administrative fees on top of that we'll be able to plug into this
Well, it's part of the 2.8
part of
million.
it. Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Further questions of the presenter by the board? Seeing none, open for public comment.
Vicki Reinke, Angels Camp. I just have a question on CDBG, whatever, grants. Sometimes there's strings attached that we would need to know about ahead of time because sometimes there's requirements that come to us that maybe we really didn't want to be a part of. So I was just curious if this grant has any of those kinds of housing strings attached. Thank you.
Thank you. Further public comment? Mr. Snowden, go ahead.
Steve Snowden. I walked in a little late on this, and I'm sorry. But if these are grants for the tree removal and what have you, I live in Murphy's and on a 2 dead-end long skunk ranch in Penn Gulch, and both of those creeks are just inundated with overgrowth, and to me they create quite a fire hazard and a health hazard as they lean and they fall over when we get snow. And I just wondered if they ever had any grants for that type of stuff to clear out the debris and overgrowth in those creeks and areas that present a hazard to the health. Okay. I'm dealing with that as I go through with my lot split. And it's true. I mean, they're continuing to build houses up there because they had their APN and they were allowed to. And it just seems to me it's going to be a death trap if it ever goes up. And I'm concerned is all. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Further public comment? Then we'll close public comment, and maybe we can address the questions brought up during public comment.
Okay, regarding the first question about strings, okay, well, as you all know, anytime you're dealing with state or federal funds, there are always overlay requirements that I suppose some people would label as strings, such as prevailing wages for construction. For environmental, you have the National Environmental Policy Act. You know, there's a whole series of things that are a standard part of federal programs and community development block grants in particular. Regarding housing, the county is required to advocate for fair housing. You know, you have to have a process for housing complaints, for promoting fair housing, that sort of thing, but there is no specific requirement that you build housing that's related to this, so I'm not sure whether that answers that question or not. Regarding the second question, under CDBG, many things are eligible. You know, a whole array of activities are eligible. Under the state program, because it is a competitive program, it's a pretty narrow swath that are competitive and fundable. So that sort of activity probably would not be. And actually, what you're proposing under this particular application would normally not be fundable under CDBG either. It's just that it is a special NOFA that is addressed at disasters. And that's the reason that you're able to do this.
These are federal or state grants?
It's HUD money that passes through to the State Department of Housing and Community Development.
Thank you. Further public comment? Then we're going to close the hearing and bring it back to the board to deliberate. Any comments by the board members? Seeing none, I'm sorry,
I was
Supervisor.
just going to make a motion. I
Oh,
thought you were getting
okay.
ready to cue it up.
You're getting in my head. I would entertain a motion.
So moved.
Moved by Supervisor Garamendi. Second by Supervisor Clapp. No further public comment. All in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Opposed indicate by saying no. Hearing none, motion passes 5-0 unanimous.
Thank you.
Madam Clerk.
So just,
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take about a 5-minute break real quick to allow Planning Department to set up. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we'll be starting again. If anybody's out in the foyer, they may want to come in. Madam Clerk.
my mic. Item 26 is from the Planning Department to adopt an ordinance amending the zoning of real property in Calaveras County from rural residential, RR5, to residential agriculture, RA, for Jed Richardson.
Mr. Mauer.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the board. This is a continued hearing from July. As you may recall, there was a 2-2 vote. First to deny the request because it takes 3 votes to take a positive action on something. That was the decision of the board to continue this to the point where the full board could be here. You did receive a memorandum from me earlier this week. Because of that, we would recommend that you reopen the public hearing to consider this additional information. This was based on some of the questions and requests that the board had at the last hearing on some additional details surrounding this request. If you reopen the public hearing, which we recommend that you do, I would limit the public testimony to those items that were added to the by the memo. There are copies of the memo sitting up here on the podium for members of the public. We don't really have any additional information or any additional, I'll let everyone grab a copy of that first. So this is just additional background information, again, responding to some of the questions that were posed to staff at the last hearing. So with that, if you have any questions, particularly on any of the issues that we raised, I guess first decide whether or not to reopen the public hearing on this.
Okay. I'll open the public hearing. We have everybody present, everybody settled down.
Do we have a little more time to read this?
Sure. 3 to 5 minutes? Okay.
Yeah, I can respond, I think, except Indian Meadows subdivision. My name's
We're not-
Len
we're
Ringat.
not- We haven't got public comment yet, sir. Hi, Lynn, how are you?
You'll let me know.
I'll let you know.
I'll be right over there.
Got you.
Mr. Mayor can explain the memo.
Okay, So I'll just briefly go over some of the details of it. There was a request to have a little background on the history of the subdivision. It was the Indian Meadow subdivision. It was originally 10-acre parcels. I think there were 7 parcels, 6 of which were 10. There was a 20-acre parcel in there. That was recorded in 1979. Following that, within a short time period, a couple years later, 1 or 2 owners applied for a rezone and parcel maps to further subdivide those into 5-acre parcels. Somewhere during that process, the board directed staff to include the entire subdivision as a part of the rezoning. And so the whole subdivision was rezoned to RR5. Subsequently, other parcel maps further subdivided those, so the entire subdivision became 5-acre parcels. There was a question regarding the level of service on Michael and Cave City Road. Public Works responded to our inquiry and said that both roads are currently operating at LOSB, and the proposed project, the proposed rezone, would not reduce that level of service. As far as the differences between the rural residential and residential agricultural districts, the principal difference is that the more commercial aspects of agricultural use, having a tasting room, ranch, or the activities associated with farming, more commercial activities associated with farming would be permitted. Events up to 12 per year allowed by right. Beyond that, require either an administrative use permit or a special use permit, where they're not permitted in the RR zone. So those are primary differences between the RR and the RA, would be the sort of associated activities related to agricultural. And finally, there were some questions about wells and groundwater. And the area is defined as having a high groundwater potential, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you drill a well anywhere up in the fractured rock system that you're going to come up with a gusher. You come up dry in one location, and 100 yards away have a 10-gallon-a-minute well. It's very difficult to, in fact, next to impossible to analyze the effect of a well on adjacent wells in a fractured rock system, because you just don't know the interconnection between those fracture zones and whether or not one well affects another. So there's really no ability for us to analyze the potential for impacts to wells from agricultural activities. But again, remember that the same level of agricultural activity from a farming perspective is allowed in both the RR and the RA zone, despite the purpose statement that is in each one. If you go through the list of permitted uses, the same agricultural activities are allowed in both zones. So while the RR zone purpose statement says it's intended to provide lands for personal ranches in which residential use is the primary land use, to establish to permit small-scale farming primarily for personal use and not as a primary use of the property. While the while the RA zone says that there's equal emphasis is assigned to residential and agricultural use, and it's to provide lands for small-scale and personal-scale farming and ranching, as well as larger residential parcels. So there's a difference in the purpose statement. Unfortunately, other than those few allowed uses in the RA zone related to wineries and special events, the list of permitted uses are more or less the same.
Excuse me, counsel, this submission of information or evidence, if you will, can be considered by the board at this time. This is a continuation of a hearing, is that correct?
Under the rules and procedures, Rule 21, if staff recommends that new evidence or communication comes in between the closing of the prior hearing and, for instance, today's hearing, they can recommend to the board to reopen the hearing so that new evidence or new communication would come into the record for the board to consider in rendering its decision. As you've heard, Mr. Maurer is recommending that the board reopen the public hearing to consider this evidence. I would just note that the rules and procedures do require it for the board as a body to concur, not just the board chair. So if the board does in fact want to reopen or concur with Mr. Mauer's recommendation to reopen the hearing, the board as a whole should state that.
Thank you, council. That was for clarity. Can we accomplish that by vote or by poll?
Poll is sufficient.
Okay. Before we proceed, I'd like to poll the board whether or not to consider this information presented by Mr. Mauer. Supervisor Clapp?
I would be for, as long as the chair keeps it to just what's new. I don't want to start rehashing what we already heard the last time. So I would like to want to be very narrow.
Okay, thank you for your recommendation. Supervisor Mills?
Yes, and I think that's the intent too, is to only talk about and deal with the new information.
Okay, thank you. Supervisor Tofinelli?
I agree.
Supervisor Garamendi?
I agree.
I also, as board chair, agree. Thank you, council. Sorry for the interruption, Mr. Mauer. Do you have further?
No, maybe just to be clearer on the differences between the RA and the R zone, the agricultural uses. Under the permitted use section of the RA, the ones that are different are greenhouse, wholesale, retail, nursery, on-farm sales, roadside stand, produce stand, tasting room, and U-pick operations. Those are the uses that are allowed in the RA zone that are not allowed in the RR zone. There are a few others, but I think as it relates to the agricultural pursuits that are allowed in the zone. Otherwise, the agricultural operations is a permitted use in the RA zone. It's the same agricultural operations in the RR zone. So farming activities such as raising animals, growing fruit, nut crops, truck farms, those kinds of things are permitted uses in both zones.
Thank you, sir.
I have a question. Can you use tenant housing in that? You know, farm housing, however you want to suggest it?
I don't think that we allow ag employee housing in either zone by right. They require either administrative use permit or a conditional use permit to peruse the. I don't see it in either zone, so it's not something we allow.
Further questions of Mr. Mauer by the board? Supervisor Tofinelli?
Mr. Mauer, I have a copy of the Title 17.
Sir, can I ask you to speak into the mic?
Title
Thank you.
17 here in front of me. And I have RA under 17.20.020, permitted uses. It says the following uses are permitted in the RA zone. Single-family dwelling, 1 permitted, general plan density. B, accepted farming practices. C, commercial agriculture. D, accepted timber practices. F, commercial greenhouse and a wholesale nursery. I go over to RR zone under 17.22.020 permitted uses. None of those show as permitted uses in the RR zone. However, it does say that under conditional uses, commercial agriculture. So under the explanation of the purpose of the zoning, it says to permit small-scale farming primarily for personal use. And if you want to do any commercial, you must go before the Planning Commission and this board to get a conditional use permit to do that. And that's the difference that we have here between RR and RA, as far as what I'm saying, because you're not allowed a commercial operation in an RR zone.
I think we are looking at two different versions of the code. There have been a number of amendments over the years, because I have the one most recent that I printed off the internet today. That's the Muni Code. What's the date on the version that you have there?
2000?
Because it was amended in 2005, and there were amendments in 2000 as well as in 2005. And I think you are looking at an older version of the code
So
there?
you're telling me that this was in 2005?
I know there were some significant amendments made to the agricultural zones and rural residential zones to look at accessory agricultural activities. It was before I got here. I don't know the exact date. I'm assuming that was a 2005 amendments, because what you're reading there is not what is in the current code.
Well, let me ask you this then. In RA, does it have commercial agriculture as a permitted use?
The term commercial agriculture is not listed in either zone. That was a term that I think was changed during those code amendments to agricultural operations, and there was another term that was used in the updates to the code a decade or so ago that modified our ordinance to allow more, and I think it was primarily in response to the wine grape industry and winery industry, that amendments were made that accommodated more of those uses in both the RR and the RA zone, for better or worse. Unfortunately, the term commercial agriculture is still defined in the code in the definition section. It wasn't taken out of there. They added the new definitions, and they didn't really change the purpose statement that I could tell, but they did change the whole list of uses was changed fairly dramatically, and I believe that happened in 2005.
So you're saying that any type of agriculture is permitted in an RR zone at any scale? If you own a 5-acre lot, you can turn the whole 5-acre lot into, as long as you have a house on it, commercial industry?
That's the way I would read the code, because the term agricultural operations is a very broad category of uses, and I can pull it up on the computer here and identify what that is in a moment. But both RR and RA allow agricultural operations as a use permitted by right, and we do not issue any kind of permits for that. There's no building permit required. There's no grading permit required for agricultural operations, because they're exempt from the grading permit process. So someone could plant a vineyard or an orchard or raise chickens or cows up to the point of it being a nuisance in either zone without any approval from the county in any way.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Supervisor Mills?
Yes, Mr. Mauer, do you agree that the site development standards for the RR zone and the RA zone are the same? I can give you the Muni Code section. I have it here. I took the time to compare these two sections, and I'm speaking to something that's concerning me is maximum density, maximum lot coverage. Subsection C of 17 point, whose phone? 17.22.070 is the RR zone, and in subsection B it talks about maximum density, but in section C it says maximum lot coverage. And both the RR and the RA zones say the same thing here.
Okay.
I wouldn't ask the question if I didn't have the answer, right? My concern is maximum lot coverage 25%. That's the density that is being requested in our codes. What does that really mean in terms of what we can do with that property?
Lot coverage is the amount of area covered by buildings. As
By
defined
buildings.
in the code.
Okay. So it has nothing to do with how intense we can use the rest of the property. It's only by how much of dwellings or other accessory buildings are on that site.
That's the footprint of the foundations of structures, I think is what the exact definition is,
Okay.
which on a parcel the size of Mr. Richardson's would be approximately 140,000 square feet.
Because our code doesn't lead into this discussion on site development by saying anything about buildings. So I can't jump to a conclusion that
That's true, you'd have to go.
it's
through
only
the-
about
You'd have to
building.
go through the definitions to see what each one says.
yeah, I can't jump to the conclusion it's only about buildings because it doesn't so state in the code. That is my point.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Done?
Yes, thank you.
Supervisor Garamendi, do you have comments?
I don't have any questions. I'll wait till deliberations.
Okay. Mr. Mauer, do you have further on your initial presentation?
Just in response, I was able to pull up the definition of lot coverage. Lot coverage means the percent of lot area overcovered by a building footprint. That's the definition of lot coverage.
It's where in the code?
1706-1150 is in the definition section.
Thank you.
Okay. Any further, sir?
No.
Right now, we'll hear from the applicant. Mr. Richardson, do you wish to address?
Yes, I do. Sorry. Jed Richardson, owner of Cave City Vineyards. I guess I'm a little unclear as to, we will only speak to items in this related to the additional evidence? Or may I say anything?
Has it been presented before, sir?
Has, some of what I was going to say was presented before. I could leave that out.
Okay, we're looking at new information as
Okay.
a continuance, so
Okay.
you may speak to those issues.
Okay, great. So, this is a little bit difficult because I just read this, but my application for rezoning, I choose not to withdraw that or change it at this point because even though the current use does appear to be permitted under RR zoning, it still limits me as to what I could do in the future and how I could use my property. It's been shown by the planning department that my property is suitable for rezoning to RA, which would allow me to have on-site sales of vegetables, a roadside stand, and if I choose in the future, a small winery. The wine industry is a very important business for this company. The executive director of the Wine Alliance will be speaking to you next week about that subject. And I don't think we should do anything which hinders an important industry within this county. It's a site that has been there as a vineyard for 17 years. I have received no complaints until now. And I think that my use is consistent with the general plan and what we'd like to see in this county in the future as far as small wineries or small businesses related to vegetables. You've received a number of letters from my neighbors, including Alan Sender, who has immediately adjoining me, who fully supports this, and a number of winery owners. I have copies of all those, but you can look through your emails and read those if you want. But there's a number of winery owners who support this, I believe 5 or 6. So I think that this is important commerce for the small community of Mountain Ranch. It's something that we desperately need in this county. It's something that is totally consistent with land use. And it's something that I think is generally supported by the public, no matter what their opinions on other subjects. So I would urge you to approve this rezoning to allow for the further expansion of the wine industry in this county. Thank you.
Okay. Questions of the applicant by board or staff? Seeing none, we'll open to public comment.
George Fry. First question I have is, it was a 2-2 vote, which makes it a denial, and it's now come back. I'm curious to know the two people that voted in favor of it and the two people that voted not in favor of it that are on the board.
George?
Council?
George,
That's public comment, George. We'll have to address that if we wish to when we get done with public comment, but we'll record your question.
Well, okay. How many acres are we talking about? I don't have the
We'll
originals.
record that after
Pardon me?
public. We'll record your question, and we'll answer that after public comment.
Oh, okay. And it was mentioned that it was Michael Road. Is there another road? I heard, is there another road involved in it? So those are my three questions. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon, Board. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak. My name's Rolanda DeRozier Lewis. I have the property on the corner of Adobe Gulch and Cave City Roads. There's one parcel between us and the applicant. My parents built this home 25 years ago. I'm the person who submitted the only letter that came in included in your board packet. Unfortunately, I had only heard that 30 minutes prior. My mother handed it to me, and so it was a quick deal, and I didn't look at your application. But after further looking at the application, I fully intended to appear at the July 25th board, but I am my mother's sole caregiver, and her health issues prevented me from attending. I'll address the items that we're allowed today. We currently have 2 wells on the property. Within a year after the vineyard was put in, the first well went dry. Grapes need water continually throughout the year to even prevent freezing, so there's never a time they don't get watered. Especially if you have young plants, to prevent shock, they're continuously watered. So I would love to have green fields for my horses for pasture, but we have nothing for irrigation. With the additional plants, I expect more wells will go dry. In 2014, California passed the water bond. This provided billions of dollars in water improvement and infrastructure expenditures for sustainable groundwater management. Monies went to local agencies to do so. Plans were supposed to be implemented. This was presented to the board in November 2014. After 5 years of drought, one good winter, management of groundwater still remains a priority. Children's safety, this will be a part of the traffic. I'll combine it. What you see on the very first page are the 2 bus stops on the road that we're talking about on Cave City. As a retired school superintendent, I would be seriously concerned about the safety of my students on Cave City Road. One, there are 2 buses stops on Cave City 1. One is adjacent to our property, which is Adobe Gulch in Cave City. The other is right on the corner. The applicant's property is right in between. Secondly, Cave City is a frequent field trip attraction for many school districts in our area. It only takes one under the influence driver to end a young life. I would find that unconscionable. Cave City is a very narrow road, and you will see several pictures of the road that's quite different than what was in the packet. Cave City is a very narrow road that does not lend itself to high traffic for harvesting grapes or providing a tasting room. There's virtually no parking on the property, which would require visitors to park alongside the road, which is currently prohibited. However, there's so many other violations right now existing on the property. Who would enforce parking violations? In conclusion, I've listed 3 concerns, or actually 2 concerns about rezoning the property listed. As Mr. Garamendi stated about the applicant, he has a right to grow what he wants for his personal use. But all due respect, Mr. Garamendi, we have a right to a certain quality of life, and this applicant doesn't have a right to take it away. I sincerely request that this board carefully consider the rights of everyone in this community, not just the applicant. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
My name's Lynn Ringette. I'm a 40-year resident. I'm Lynn Ringette. I'm a 40-year resident of Mountain Ranch. And I think we've been throwing a real curveball by being forced to address these issues. Even the board itself had questions as to what the meaning of the content was. Most of these folks have been here all day. They've been here at previous encounters, hadn't had an opportunity to peruse this. The real issue, as I see it, isn't so much Mr. Richardson's organic tomatoes, but rather the pot grow. And the allowing of an expansion of his operation, it just sets a precedent for other growers, legal or otherwise, to look to the Butte Fire Area, District 2, as a approved growing zone for marijuana. This isn't what I intended to address right now. What I was really going to look to was the impact of marijuana in general on the area, the level of debris that we see along roadways, the bad neighbors that these individuals make. Every one of us here can bring horror stories about having to deal with these growers who come from out of the area with no commitment or to our community beyond financial gain. They're not here to make this a better place. They pollute our roadways, they litter our roadways. I have a grow that has to cross an easement to get to my property. I have to deal with tremendous amounts of commercial traffic that overburden my road. They damage my property. They leave my gates open, allowing my livestock to get out of the road. You go into Mountain Ranch to Sender's Market, you see these people idly standing around. They have aggressive dogs. I've seen them urinate in the parking lot, these growers, with the car door open because they can't be bothered to find a restroom. When you see them in groups, these individuals are purposely aggressive toward the locals. They're rude. A good neighbor of ours, a good neighbor of Mr. Richardson, Tony Nunes, moved 2 months ago. He was surrounded on three sides by growers. The noise of their activities, the indifference that they showed to him wasn't even the factor. The lights from their operation was so bright at night that it actually shadowed his house and he couldn't sleep. So he's had to move to Angels Camp. You'll hear stories like that from all of these folks. And that's the issue that really needed to be addressed. I can tell you from personal experience, I've been a peace officer largely in this county for well over 32 years. If you count my part-time, almost 40. I've been a deputy probation officer for juveniles, for adults, 26 years as a state parole agent in this area. Last 4 years, I've served our court services as a part-time deputy sheriff. I see juveniles come into that court on a regular basis where marijuana is a contributing factor to their juvenile delinquency. Now, they have no problem at all getting hold of marijuana now. And you can only imagine with the expansion and allowed expansion of the grows in this community, we aren't just accepting that as some type of something that we have to tolerate its existence. No, we accept it, we endorse it, and that is not the message you want to give to the children of this county. So that's the problem with Mr. Richardson. He doesn't fall into that category, I understand that. But again, it's an incremental step. Allowing him to expand his operation allows others to do the same thing. They look to that as a precedent. And my fear is District 2 becomes the marijuana growing zone for Calaveras. So relinquish my time.
Thank you, sir.
Bill McManus. As we look back on this thing and forward with some of this new information, I think what's been forgotten in the mix is, and I think the gentleman just brought it up, this has a marijuana grow on his property as well. But before we get into that, in talking to some of the neighbors that live adjacent to this property, we started talking about the concept of a subdivision. And a subdivision is a covenant that's made with people who buy property in that subdivision.
Excuse me, Mr. McManus. Ladies and gentlemen, please show some courtesy to our speakers. If you need to have a conversation, I'd request you take it out in the foyer. Thank you. Mr. McManus, you can have your time back.
Thank you. Now, if I get my thought back, I'd be in good shape. Anyway, when we were talking about subdivisions, property, large pieces of property are subdivided into smaller pieces. Whether there's HOA or CC&Rs, it doesn't really make too much difference. when that property is being sold, the realtor will represent it as being zoned in a certain way. And that's why you buy the property. And usually the realtor will also tell you it's going to take a lot to change that zoning. So that becomes the covenant. That's why people buy it. They don't want to buy RR and end up with commercial property or 24-hour truck washes. They want RR land to live on. In this case, we're taking RR land, which by the appellate's own admission has been illegally growing vegetables on the property. Doesn't have a permit to do that. He has vineyards on the property. Well, maybe that's okay. He has a marijuana grow on the property. And he's also stated that from time to time, a frequency of maybe 12 times a year, which is once a month, wants to have special events on this property, which means we're going to have a miniature ironstone in the middle of a residential neighborhood. That is not what these people signed up for when they bought their property. It's intellectually dishonest to say that you're just trying to change your farming habits or the way you want to grow crops or whatever you want to do. The appellate at the last meeting told us, I don't want to grow marijuana anymore. I want to grow organic vegetables. I want to grow grapes. I want to make wine. When we asked him about the marijuana crop, he said, well, I really don't want to grow it anymore, but it's going to take me 2-3 months to get rid of it. Now, is that considered a self-abatement, or is that considered a harvest? How much honesty is really is involved in this? If you change the zoning, and even if they have to get a conditional use permit, what do the homeowners do if they want to oppose that? Do they have to pay a fee? Do they have to appeal it? How hard is it for them to stop it once you let someone start doing it by goofing around with their zoning? The zoning was set a certain way for a reason. If it was appropriate to have shopping centers and car washes and everything else in this area, there would have been land set aside for that. There wasn't. This is for people to live in their homes, to have a quiet lifestyle, a lifestyle they worked all their life for in many cases. I have a letter, I don't know if you want to hear it or not, from the property owner, and I'm not going to say the names, but it expresses the kind of feeling that they have. We are old. We were always law-abiding, raised that way. Not old, law-abiding, I presume. I can't get over this attitude that if you were illegally growing before, you should be okay to grow commercially now. It's fine to work on changing the law, but not following the law when it gets in your way financially is wrong. As far as I'm concerned, I don't know if I can say this word, a scufflaw? I think that's an old-timey word. I think it means rascals or something like that. Shouldn't be allowed to profit from their illegal, unpermitted behavior. But then we're old. That was from the resident. And she's concerned, and her husband's concerned about their lifestyle and what the fight will continue for them to preserve their lifestyle if you allow more activities to be dumped in there where they have to fight them, even if it's conditional. So they're asking that you reject this. And they're hoping that, that the marijuana grow goes away. And we're not going to be a miniature ironstone next door to them.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you.
First off, let me state my name. I'm the person that believes that we should look to the supervisor that the project's in for direction. This is one day I may come to you and ask you for a favor. That day may never come. Yeah, my concerns with this project are that rural residential and residential agriculture and the difference here, and what is allowed in rural agriculture as opposed to rural residential, and that is that it's a tasting room that you can just go in and get a permit for. that's not going to have any concerns of meeting the standards that the neighbors might have for their neighborhood. And we have a similar case in the Dollar General store, in which the neighbors, well, Valley Springs and Railroad Flat, have decided that in West Point, in the Dollar General store, we have to look at the entire project, what is allowed on that property, not just that we're changing the zoning, but what the project may be on that property. And we have to have that fully vetted. So that is one of my concerns. You have another tasting room in there, or you used to have, I think it's shut down now, Malvino. And he had to go through a process that was much different. And if you notice outside of his property, it has a sidewalk, because it was a far different situation, but he had to meet certain standards. And this is not going to have to meet any standards. It's just going to be, you can just go in and get that permit for that tasting room. That's my concern. As far as public safety, in West Point, the Dollar General store, they're claiming the children are going to walk to it. I'm not sure if people are going to be walking to a tasting room. I don't think that is the case. Then, in fact, I hope it is not the case here. So my concern is that this has not been fully vetted. It should take about 18 months to get to change zoning or split a piece of property that's allowable, because we have to take everything into consideration. We have to take the entire project, and we're going to be hearing that before the Planning Commission on Thursday. I do not want to be there. So unless you're going to behave in a manner that I consider repugnant and hold people to different standards, you're going to have to take this as an entire project. You may have to send it back to the Planning Commission for them to hold some public hearings in Mountain Ranch, not here. With 2 minutes to go, I like to take all my time because I pay property taxes here, and I like to get all my money's worth. The inside joke that I have, I really do support this project. I just don't support the way that we're unevenly moving forward with these things. The inside joke is I've known Jed Richardson since he was a tall white man. It has to do with somebody that showed up in his place at one day when he was putting in the vineyard. And I had a business up and down California that put in vineyards. Andy Beckstoffer up there in Napa set me up because I was out on a piece of property in Mendocino County and that I owned, and I was installing my own vineyard. And he says, well, we have to install a vineyard over here. Why don't you do it for us? And then he told his cohorts, and pretty soon I had 93 employees and responsibility. I particularly don't like responsibility, but that's as long as I've known Mr. Richardson. And he's a fine man. I do support his project, but we have to be even-handed in how we do this. And I think everybody would agree to that we're not being even-handed. So, with either send it back to the Planning Commission, or vote it down now and make him resubmit his application, and get some further direction from the Planning Commission how they want to proceed. Thank you very much, and
Thank you,
it was
sir.
good seeing you. I hope you like the beard. We're working on it. You might not see it some other time, but we're working on it.
Good afternoon, Board. Chris Metz. Calaveras County should support its right to farm. Mr. Richardson's property has been an active vineyard for over 17 years. As time has gone on, he's increased his production, and the zoning RA is more appropriate than RR. As a small business owner and resident of District 2, I would enjoy the ability to taste wine produced locally. If Mr. Richardson would like to install a tasting room, he would be required to have that RA zoning. The time that I've known Mr. Richardson, I found him to be an upstanding citizen, nothing but kind and generous. So I'll be brief today. I would urge you to accept his request for rezoning. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon, Board. My name is Gary Lewis, Mountain Ranch, District 2. My wife previously presented some concerns that she has. In the packet of photographs you have, I will be addressing those as well. I am curious and somewhat troubled as to how we got to this point regarding this issue in the first place. This application is in fact being submitted more than a decade following the continuing development of this land and is prima facie evidence from the more than 85+% of arable land that's under cultivation. These plantings are clearly visible in the aerial photographs that are in that packet, which I am disappointed to note that no one from any of the county's regulatory agencies, including the planning department, has apparently either failed to notice or enforce the obvious violation of the county's own zoning codes for either the RA or an RA use. As stated clearly in the definitions for each of these designations, specifically now for RA, for which the application is desired, RA provides for equal emphasis allowed for residential and agricultural use, as well as larger residential parcels. The current 85+% agricultural use is exceeding the equal emphasis clause. And clearly, more than 3 times the allowable 25% for agricultural use. As to why the application is now being submitted so many years after the property was turned into a significant commercial agricultural enterprise, was addressed by the applicant that he, and I'm quoting from the record of the July 25th meeting, was told by someone in the planning department that he could just go ahead, end quote, with his plans. So, who is this mysterious someone in the planning department that provided such inaccurate advice? I submit that any responsible applicant would and should seek the advice of the local planning department prior to engaging in such an ambitious enterprise. The applicant stated that he is a real estate agent. Being such, as his license requires, he should have known he received erroneous information and should have sought further advice or a second opinion, thus avoiding the possibility of receiving a cease and desist order from the county and the subsequent related costs. But go ahead he did, much to the detriment of his neighbor's quality of life. Further into this section, I am troubled to find the often used ubiquitous phrase, I quote, in response to questions asked in the applicant, less than significant. Apparently the Planning Commission has determined that the adverse effects resulting from this application being forwarded is less than significant. Just how was this conclusion drawn? There is already a noted significant increase in traffic, noted due to the growers, helpers, and buyers traversing these narrow roads. The adverse impact of the recent allowance of legal and illegal grows is already evident and is in fact more than significant. In my observation, the report by the Planning Department and the summary has been apparently crafted to favor the applicant, while rural residential community of the Indian Meadow subdivision has therefore not been studied, researched, or analyzed. I would request this board not approve the application in consideration of the neighboring properties and not reward the applicant by approving his application when it should have been done in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Got it.
Ladies and gentlemen, our rules are that you can speak only once on an agendized item. Let me explain. You can only speak once on an agendized item. You can speak multiple times on multiple items. Thank you.
Ben Stopper, District 5. There appears to be a lot of confusion on zoning. Earlier when I heard Dollar General brought up in West Point, they are asking for a property split. They aren't asking to change the zoning. There was originally commercial zoning there, and then they're asking to do something that doesn't take permitted. It's a permitted use on that. Now, Peter did earlier explain also that since 2005, the use that's on the property is permitted in the code within our general plan. It doesn't match 2000, it matches 2005. To move further on, there are tests. Now, when we have people next door that claim their well is dry because of what's going on in their property next door. This is a hard issue within our county because we're working within a fractured rock system. So, you know, it can be different 100 feet away and it could be the same 200 feet around that 100 feet because we don't know which course that fractured rock goes. But there are legitimate tests where people could prove this. And when you make an accusation, I think you bear the burden of proof to show that someone else is affecting your water flow. So at that point, a recovery test is a controlled field experiment for an end of a pumping test, constant rate or step down or drawdown, residual drawdown. To go on further, there is a time when you turn off your pump and then the well does come back up. These are tests that we do through the districts to test our wells and what we're doing to the surrounding aquifers. So at this point, I believe anybody making an accusation on your property that you're taking their water bears the burden of proof, not the other way around. He doesn't have to prove that he's not doing it to you. You're making the accusation. I just would like you all to take that into consideration as you move forward.
Thank you, sir.
Good day, gentlemen. My name's Lou Bumpus. I live in Mountain Ranch. First off, I looked up the definition of developed land on the internet, and it says agricultural land. 25% of a building, 25% of your land usage of 5 acres, that would be 1.25 acres of buildings according to the planning department. That would be considered an industrial park. That doesn't make sense. A greenhouse in rural residential is required to have a conditional use permit, and I never got a letter once about a conditional use permit, which that's what a conditional use permit is notifying the neighbors. I've never got one. There's 5 greenhouses there. One of those greenhouses was harvested in the middle of July, and they just replanted that 2 weeks ago. So this is just having an ongoing marijuana situation going in and out of this greenhouse. In the rural agriculture section, a greenhouse is allowed on 20 acres or more. This is the current code of this county, June 15th, 2017. I got it off the Calaveras Gov website. So the land section, whatever. There's 2 other people, only other thing to say is there's 2 other people who are my neighbors on the agenda today for their marijuana grows who are on the other side of me. And if it's okay for one guy to break violations, well, why are they getting penalized? And I don't know any of these people. I'm not in favor of any of them. I'm just asking this question. And one other thing I'd like to direct to the planning department here, your little thing that says here, however, agricultural operations are listed as the permitted use in the RR zone with no requirement to establish a residence on the property. That's wrong. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Hello, my name is Michelle Brown. I'm live in Mountain Ranch. I'm Jed's direct neighbor. Bought my house from him approximately 10 years ago, 11 years ago. You know, I'm hearing what everybody is talking about and the nuisance of his grow, and I can't honestly speak to say that I know that he has or has not broken any code violations. What I do know is I probably have one of the largest property lines against Jed. I am fortunate I have not ran out of water and I have not had any issues other than replacing a well pump, which I certainly can't attribute to that happening for Jed. I do know that when I first met Jed, I believe he's a very intelligent man, retired engineer. He's very highly organized and thinks things through very carefully, and he has never been a nuisance to me. He's always been supportive and helpful to me. I tend to believe Jed when he says he's not going to create a nuisance. He is going to continue to be professional, and he does want to expand the vision of his property. And believe me, I love my neighbors, and I certainly want to maintain a good relationship with them. I am just speaking on behalf of Jed because he has been a good neighbor to me. As far as I'm indifferent about pot growing. I do know that I think most of the traffic on the street is due to the many grows that are way past our houses. Unfortunately, there are a number of growing cars on the street that do speed. I can't say that I can attribute that to Jed, especially based on where his property is located. And I do know that he does grow, and I will say that everybody has been very respectful, and I never hear a commotion, never have had an issue. So with that being said, that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you.
Okay? Thank you very much.
I grew up in a mountain county, and water rights was a big issue. And if your water disappears at the same time somebody plants a vineyard, I would say that that is a good indication that the person who lost their water was affected by the person who started watering a lot of grapes. And it's really unfair for people to have their home and some water so they can live there and then have that taken away. Water is the best commodity that we have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Reed Larson, Mountain Ranch. I'm the cannabis cultivation registrant at 7653 Cave City Road. Furthermore, I'm a community member and a property owner. I was here before the land rush, and I'll be here after the land rush. As I stated at Mr. Richardson's previous hearing, I won't be cultivating cannabis there after this year. So please, let's leave cannabis out of this decision. So this is a pretty straightforward land use request. There's a trust factory across from Mr. Richardson's property. There's multiple businesses down the road from Mr. Richardson's property. A small vineyard, organic vegetable production, and/or small winery hardly compares in terms of traffic and resources. As Plan Director Mr. Maurer stated, Mr. Richardson is growing grapes and organic vegetables in accordance with the zoning, so claims of illegal cultivation are absurd. Please, let's support a community member, a great neighbor, and a friend trying to make a living on their property. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Kim Bumpus, Mountain Ranch, District 2. Those comparisons to the neighbors across are not part of our subdivision. I keep hearing comparisons to, those are much larger parcels of land and can probably support more water usage. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Board. Trevor Woodkey, District 2, Calaveras Cannabis Alliance. A couple issues I'd like to bring up. I'd like to remind everyone this is not a cannabis appeal. This is a application for rezoning. Cannabis
sorry, what? Excuse me. All right. Supervisor Clapp, I'll be paying attention to that.
Am I allowed to continue discussing
As long
this
as you're
issue?
staying on the topic of new information. And keep it on the actual agenda item.
Okay, I would just like to point out that nothing was said by anyone about the previous speakers who got up and spoke only about cannabis. So, moving forward, I would like to point out that there's a procedural issue here. Limiting this hearing to a document which the applicant only just received at the start of the hearing seems prejudicial against the applicant. It also, limiting me and my ability to speak also seems prejudicial against my ability to speak on this issue when other people have been allowed to speak on this issue without having their time interrupted. Secondarily, this is a non-controversial land issue, land use decision. There is no history of complaints on this property, so all of these people who are coming up and complaining about their neighbor, and the history of cultivation on his property, which they continually characterize as illegal, never took the time to make these complaints over the preceding decades that this property has been under cultivation, and this land use characteristic has been the character under which it has been used. It would seem that if this were creating the problems that everybody is saying that is creating, these issues would have been brought up previously. Furthermore, I sent an email to all of the board supervisors. I'd like to read some of that email into the record. I would like the board to know that there is another similar rezoning request that will be submitted by a winery owner looking to rezone his RR property to RA for an existing vineyard and tasting room under construction in Murphy's. There are also many existing vineyards and wineries currently located in RR zoning, which would more appropriately be rezoned. Your decision with regard to Mr. Richardson's case will set a significant precedent on future decisions regarding land use issues in the county and will affect the success of the vitally important wine industry. It is important that the county treat everyone who comes before them equally under the law. Mr. Richardson is only trying to do the right thing here. Now, again, I would say that to the extent that cannabis is not the issue here, that should apply to everyone who is engaging in deliberations. Cannabis is not the issue. This is purely a land use zoning issue, and that should be the focus of deliberations of everyone involved.
Thank you. Excuse me, sir, before we start, how many more public speakers do we have? Please raise your hand. One. Okay, thank you. Go ahead, sir.
Jason Campbell, District 5. I have a couple points to make here. First, I'll write off this letter that we received earlier today. It says, it was the determination of Public Works that the change in the zoning would not significantly increase traffic or require any mitigation measures. And so we also heard from Reed just a few minutes ago, stating that he does not plan on cultivating there next year. So if anything, I would think that there would be potential for a reduction in traffic. Also, if you do not believe what Reed is saying, because a lot of people tend to think that growers don't tell the truth, Mr. Richardson is the one who has ultimate power over that decision. It's his land. He can terminate cultivation there at any time he chooses. Also, it may not be everyone's American dream, but I'm sure that there's a lot of us that have the American dream of acquire a piece of property, work said piece of property, and make a living, make it pay for itself. Some other things. Also, a quote from the sheriff. Legal growers are not the ones causing the problems. I'd like to repeat that. Quote from the sheriff. Legal growers are not the ones causing the problem. This isn't a cannabis issue. Everyone wants to make it a cannabis issue. Like it's been stated before, there's been no previous complaints until now. And all those complaints now are derived from the fact that there is a cannabis grow there. And that should not be taken into consideration due to the information that we've received that is going to be terminated this season. So, as stated before, simple land use issue. I don't think that it should be, it's the same case of squash all new business in this county. There's anti-growth in this county, and I think that has a big deal about what's going on here. I just don't think that this is right. He hasn't caused any problems. He's a respectable citizen. He's environmentally responsible, professional. I honestly would like to see this approved. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further public comment? I know there we go.
Jennifer Smith, Calaveras County resident. One of my big concerns is that I tried to get my property rezoned and was told at the planning department, don't even bother. You've got a cannabis grow. This is not about cannabis. This is about land use. We're being held hostage by this pending general plan. We've got commercial activity that can't come into this county because there's no appropriate zoning. So I took a minute and I looked up what Jed's property zoning would be under the new proposed general plan. That new proposed zoning is rural transitional. And directly from that definition, it says, typical activities include small farming, berry farms, vineyards, vegetable farms, chicken egg operations, orchards, tree farms, and animals for personal or small-scale commercial use. This parcel currently consists of a vineyard and vegetable farm. Jed is getting ahead of the curve. He knows that that's where his property is going, that's where his property should be, and I encourage this board to honor the future that we're trying to get in this county with an appropriate general plan and honor the decisions made by the previous commission. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further public speakers? Seeing none, we're going to take a 10-minute break, give our staff a chance. We'll be back in 10 minutes, folks. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We'll reconvene. Is there any further public speakers? Seeing none, we'll bring it back to the board. And prior to doing that, I personally have to make a disclosure. I'd like to disclose that I viewed the video of the public hearing held on July 25th in its entirety. I was not present for that meeting. I was on county business out of state. I fully reviewed all the evidence presented at that meeting by viewing the video twice. Further, the public should be aware that generally when a public hearing has been closed, which it was on the 25th, no further comments or evidence are received at that subsequent meetings unless it's recommended by the public hearing to be reopened. And that's what we did earlier. We did that by the poll of the board. If there's any question about that, I'd be happy to address that after we complete this agenda item or at the end of the meeting. Okay. Seeing public comments are closed at this time, Mr. Maurer, do you have any comments to make?
During the break, Supervisor Toffenelli pointed out to me that the code clearly requires a conditional use permit for a greenhouse in the RR and requires one in the RA zone if you have less than 20 acres. It is a use permitted by right for a greenhouse for properties over 20 acres. So I just wanted to make that clarification that we do have a situation here where the greenhouse is technically unauthorized, and unless a use permit was taken out, when you built that I'm not aware of, that would be out of compliance. We would go through our normal code compliance process to address that. I just want to bring that out as a point of clarification. Thank you, Mr. Toffenelli, for bringing that to my attention.
Okay. Thank you. I'd like to give the applicant a chance to respond.
So I'd like to take this opportunity to respond to some of the objections made. So we have already established that I am not growing anything illegally on the property. Per the existing code, I have been growing grapes and vegetables totally to code. The cannabis grow that Reed operates, that I lease the property to, is fully registered and compliant. And I'd also like to say that additional uses afforded by the RA zoning, there's been some objections to like a tasting room. I have no plans for a tasting room. I'm trying to simply do the right thing and get the right zoning for what's on the property right now. If I were to do an expansion of a tasting room or a winery, that would have to be before the building department for review. And if there are other issues regarding the land and where I want to put those things and traffic, all that would be addressed at that point. So you should not deny this based on a hypothetical future use that would require review anyway. Okay, Mr. Lewis is concerned about the scale of my vineyard as being more than 25% of the land use, and I think we've established that that only applies to buildings. Obviously, agriculture is a very intensive and costly venture, and the profit margins are very slim. To tell a farmer he can't use his land for farming would not be appropriate. As far as the hoop houses, all of the cannabis hoop houses are permitted. 2 of the hoop houses are used for vegetables. I did get those permitted this year, and with temporary permits. And so all of the structures, all the hoop houses are currently permitted. Let's see, water use. Water is, of course, a very important thing in our community, and I have a deep well. It draws, it was rated at 75 gallons a minute when I drilled it in 1999, and I use a very small fraction of the water that that well can produce. It was 75 gallons a minute. I pump it 15 to 20 gallons a minute at night using drip irrigation on timers. Traffic will not increase. I'm not proposing anything different. The water use is not going to increase. The traffic is not going to increase. If I expand things, yes, maybe the traffic would increase if I had a small winery for employees, but it's not going to be appreciable. I mean, down the street, there's school buses going up and down the street all day long, taking kids to the California Caverns. There's a trucker who has a yard down the street, and his trucks are going up and down the street all day long. The truss factory, Sender's Truss Factory, is across the street. So, you know, to characterize this as a small residential neighborhood, I think would be wrong. It's a mixed-use neighborhood. And this is totally consistent with the use of my neighbors, the Senders, and the Dodges, who were here last time with objections. Their property is zoned RA, and they're directly across the street from me. I mean, it seems inconsistent that they would object to such zoning based on traffic when they have the same zoning themselves. So I would implore you to do the right thing here. I'm just trying to do the right thing as well and approve my rezoning. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Supervisor, I'm sorry, what?
Oh, sure.
Sure. Supervisor Tofinelli?
You talked about the greenhouses. You got a temporary use permit?
I did not. Cannabis hoop houses are allowed by a permitted process, a special permitting process. So I went in there and I wasn't aware that I needed a conditional use permit for my vegetable greenhouses, and I was told, well,
that's fine. You made a statement though that the two were, you got a temporary permit for them when you were standing up speaking.
Yes, and I just getting to that.
So my question was.
Yeah, so that
would be a conditional use permit that you would need.
I'm sorry?
You would need a conditional use permit for the greenhouses.
If that's what it takes, then we'll certainly pursue that, yeah. But I was given a temporary permit for those vegetable greenhouses. Vegetable greenhouses, at least one of them was paid by the USDA for local food production. So I'm happy to get a permit for it if necessary. Yeah. Okay.
Mr. Richardson, I have a question. You obtained
So I
temporary
obtained a
permits for
hoop
food
house permit,
production?
but they are hoop houses.
Let me finish my question.
Sure, I'm sorry.
As I understand it, you obtained temporary use permits for food production.
Yes,
From where?
from the county. No, not for food production, for the hoop houses.
For the hoop houses for
Yeah, that
growing
I
vegetables?
grow my vegetables in, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Mr. Mauer, do we have any recollection of that or any verification of that?
Oh, I don't know the specifics of his site regarding that. When we realized that these hoop houses created a problem from the building department, the building department developed standards for the type of permit that would be required for the hoop houses. Some of them are very temporary in nature. They're made of PVC piping. They're probably only going to be good for one season. Others are much more permanent. So there's a three-tiered process that the building department developed for the type of permit necessary based on the construction type, the size, and the potential for hazards associated with the construction. It sounds as if the type of hoop house that Mr. Richardson received permits for was for the more temporary type. I don't remember the exact amount of time, but there was a time frame that was allowed for those to stand under those permits that the building department issued.
Thank you.
And I'd like to say that I did that in order also to get engineering drawings for those. In the past, it's never been an issue of growing vegetables in hoop houses. Now that there's new regulations regarding cannabis growing in hoop houses, it's spilled over into other types of agriculture. And so I obtained a temporary permit. I've since gotten engineered plans for all those drawings, and I can certainly permit them as permanent structures at this point.
Mr. Richardson, how many total acres do you have?
I have a little under 13 acres.
13 acres?
Yes, yes. Sir.
How much of that is under cultivation for grapes?
There is 7 acres of vineyards, and the hoop houses, the vegetable hoop houses, are 30 by 72. There's 2 of those. And then the cannabis area is 6,000 square feet.
Thank you. Mr. Mauer, do we have any record of any reported violations regarding Mr. Richardson's operation for the last 17 years?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Do we need to check with code compliance, or is that pretty accurate information?
I don't know that it's necessary to check with code. I think if we'd known of violations, that would have been brought out when we circulated the zone change application to all the affected departments. Typically, we are notified by the building department if there are outstanding code violations if we have an application of this nature. So I would say it's probably very unlikely that there is an outstanding code violation.
Thank you.
The only thing I was aware of is there was, when they came out to inspect the cannabis, there was, the well hadn't had its final testing done. So I subsequently had that done.
Mr. Mauer, do you have any historical knowledge of the previous winery, McVania, mentioned in public comments?
I'm not aware of that winery.
I know a little bit about that, if you'd like.
How about letting me know?
Okay. I don't claim to know the entire knowledge about it, but this is Rocco Malvini's winery, which is located, at the time, I believe it was actually in the M24 subdivision, and but he fronted Sheep Ranch Road, and I believe he had to do some additional permitting and maybe even withdraw from the subdivision in order to convert it to a winery. But he had to withdraw from the subdivision because it was a subdivision with homeowners association. The association did not allow commercial ventures.
Thank you.
Sure.
Bear with
And
me
then
for a
just
moment.
I know there's a number of wineries and vineyards also in the Bar 20 subdivision, and that is zoned RR. So.
Mr. Mauer, Do we have any history of any conditional use permits issued for tasting rooms on winery land? Is it required?
It varies. I'm sure in the past, historically, we had requirements for a conditional use permit for wineries or tasting rooms in various zones. Since I've been here, the ordinance was changed sometime before that provided a much more liberal approach to what the wine industry and tasting facilities on RA zoned lands. There have not been any in my tenure here for a tasting room that I'm aware of. I can't think of any in the last 3.5 years.
Thank you.
And I would also say it wouldn't be a viable commercial venture for me to have a tasting room on the location in Mountain Ranch. I mean, any tasting room in the county that hasn't been on downtown Main Street and Murphy's or very close has failed. And it would definitely not be a very good venture. I'm sorry, there's some down in Copper. But Mountain Ranch would not be the prime location for a tasting room, for the parents of the kids going to the cave. Oh yeah, I could just imagine all my friends coming in and drinking wine and never buying anything. Yeah, sorry.
One more question, sir.
Yes, sir.
I did review the tapes on the 25th meeting, and I did take away from that you are ceasing your marijuana operations.
I am, yes. My growers decided, for reasons of his own, I mean, primarily economic, based on the indecision of the county on which way to go on this, to cease his operation. He doesn't want to invest any more money. So I'm fine with that. I have no intention of attempting to lease it to anybody else or growing myself. That's even not allowed, I don't think, under the current urgency ordinance. So, no, it's not going to be grown on.
Mr. Mauer, is there any procedure for allowing a conditional zone change?
Not really. There isn't anything necessarily illegal about it, but it does raise the issue of fairness. It's a legislative act. What we sometimes refer to as contract zoning or conditional zoning would end up creating a difference between other properties that are similarly zoned. And there is, I don't know, maybe there's a legal term there that Megan can help me with, but it's certainly frowned upon in county and city government to sort of treat, so you might have multiple properties all in the same zone, but there are certain conditions that are added. One is difficult to impose because this is something that runs with the land. If you have a use permit or a map where they have to validate that permit or record a final map, that you check those conditions to make sure they're satisfied before you actually issue the permit. In this case, 5 years, 10 years down the line, someone's going to look at a piece of property and say, oh, it's zoned, whatever the zoning might be, if it were approved RA. No way to really track the fact that there would be some type of limitation on that. So we certainly do not recommend it. I don't think there's anything necessarily illegal about it, but I would strongly recommend against contract zoning or conditional zoning. It just becomes very, very difficult over the long term to track that and find out what those conditions might have been imposed. As long as Mr. Richardson owns it, it'd be fine. But remember, the zoning is not just what he wants to do. It's any of the uses that are allowed within that zone would be appropriate for that site. And so even though we might have a very specific proposal at one point in time, when you're rezoning property, you have to look at the full range of uses that are allowed and determine, is it appropriate for that location given the topography, neighboring land uses, access, utilities, all those things that we consider when zoning property.
My recollection of viewing the tapes on the visuals that there is some RA zoning in this general area. That is correct?
Yes, there are several parcels either adjacent or nearby that are zoned RA.
Do you have any knowledge of when that zoning was changed to RA from RR?
Off the top of my head, I do not.
Okay. That's questions I have. Thank you, Mr. Richardson. Any questions of Mr. Richardson by the board? By staff? Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
This time, we'll bring it back to the board for discussion. Any comments? Mr. Mills.
First of all, to understand the RA zone has, under Muni Code, that's where I'm looking on it, was an equal emphasis between agriculture and residential. It says the RA zone is intended to be a district in which an equal emphasis is assigned to residential and agricultural uses. That means that one cannot overpower the other in what I see here. That's really not where the problem is. In my view, if we're going to apply zoning equally and the board makes a decision to allow the change, I have to look at that zoning map and say, what is the filed subdivision map? That did not include the AP zone to the west. It did not include the RA zone to the south. It only included those parcels in that filed subdivision map. Now let's think for a moment. Let's not put this in Mountain Ranch. Let's put this in Saddle Creek. Let's put this in Greenhorn Creek. Let's put this in any other subdivision in Calaveras County and say, if we do it here, we can do it anywhere. That's a precedent, and that's a concern. I want to go back and just remind everyone that when they're looking at a land use designation and a general plan, it is not a zone. So zoning is different from land use designations. And right now, when we look at this, I want to just remind everyone to look at the filed subdivision map and do not focus on anything outside of that subdivision map, because what you're affecting is you're affecting the financial status of everyone within that filed subdivision map by any decision you make within the realm of that boundary. That, to me, is the key point here. It isn't about what's being grown. It's not about what kind of water's being pulled. It's about the rest of that area is RR. And that means that the primary emphasis under 17.22 is to be residential first and all other uses secondary. When I look at this picture, this photo that these folks have given us, I don't see that. I don't see 17.22 being applied. I see 17.20 to some degree here, but really is it? I think it goes beyond what we consider equal use. And for now, that would be the limit of my conversation on it, is that I would be concerned about setting a precedent whereby I would be forced to allow this into a filed subdivision in District 4 and, in essence, upset the entire apple cart of some very, very nice subdivisions.
Thank you. Further comments? Supervisor Garamendi?
Did you want to make something? You go ahead. Yeah. I'm going to say what a lot of people have said here. This is not about cannabis. This is not, although a lot of the comments and complaints are about cannabis, that is not the issue that we're talking about here today. I have a feeling that if Mr. Richardson could go back in time, he would probably not have even filed, because he has the right to do what he's doing right now, planting grapes. I've gotten letters from some of the best wineries in this county saying that he is a great grape grower, and they would love more of his product. So in my mind, this is really about, ability of person to have the right to do what they can do on their land. It's about business. It's about small businesses. It's about the rural culture of our community. We are still an agricultural production county. People still own land, they work land, and they make a living off the land. That is a big part of who we are. We did it with gold, we did it with timber, and we're doing it with grapes now. If this was in Murphy's, I don't think we'd have the same conversation. But it's in a very politically hot spot right now because of cannabis. I'm actually starting a small journal of things that I hear that I just have to remember. I've never heard anybody say somebody's illegally growing vegetables. That we are, I mean, Mr. Richardson is growing vegetables that are sold in the local grocery store at Cinders. Alan wrote a letter and he called and said these are important products for him. The wineries are calling and saying it's important products. People need to have the ability to work their land and make a living. That is a part of not just our county culture, but our national culture. I don't know Mr. Richardson very well. I've met him several times during the campaign. He's been very active in the community. But I have been a member of the Boy Scouts of America for over 40 years. I'm an Eagle Scout. And I do recognize when I see somebody who holds the distinction of having a Silver Beaver Award, which is the highest honor the Boy Scouts of America give for volunteer service. That means a lot to people who are in Boy Scouts. That's something, that's a mark, a badge that we recognize. So while I don't know Mr. Richards very well, I will say that other people who do have given him the highest honor for an organization that I feel very strongly about, the Boy Scouts of America. I encourage this board to think about this exactly as we've got in front of us. This is a land use issue. It seems like we are searching for reasons to keep a person from having a business on their property and making a living. We should be promoting business in our community. This board majority has voted, has through a poll and direction of the staff, decided to ban cannabis in this county. People who own this land need to have other alternatives. Grapes don't seem to be offensive to people. I understand the concerns about the water, but there's no, and I get it. I've got wells that go dry as well, but there's no evidence that says that there's a cause and effect for this situation. I understand the issue about school buses, but school buses go up the road every day to Big Trees Park and through Murphy's, which has lots of wine tasting rooms. Mr. Richardson said he's not going to do a wine tasting room. If he wants to, we need more businesses in our community that bring tourists to us. Supervisor Tofinelli suggested we give he was clearly joking, but a nice spot to stop off for the parents who are taking their kids up to the caves. But that was funny, but we need more businesses. So I would urge this board to support agriculture in our community and support and uphold this 5-0 ruling from our planning commission. I think we all agree are thoughtful people who sent this to us for our approval. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Further comments by the board? Supervisor Tofinelli.
Yeah, I'll chime in here. And to answer George's question that never got answered, it really wasn't a 2-2 vote for 2 for and 2 against. There was a motion made, and the motion was voted, and it was a 2-2 on a motion. So there was and that was the motion to deny. There was no motion to approve. So it really wasn't 2 for and 2 against. And I was one that voted not for the motion. And the reasons I had for doing so was, one, I didn't like the presentation that was given by planning, and I had other questions they couldn't answer. And I wanted to do some investigating myself and some research myself on the issue before I decided on it. And I've done that. And to be fair to everybody in here, the issue is not what is being grown on his property in any way for me. That's not an issue. The issue, I'm sure, is not an issue. I'm sure Mr. Richardson is a great grower of crops. on anything he does. He's an outstanding individual in the communities. He's a great guy. I don't know him, but I've heard and had many emails concerning that. That's not an issue here. That's not what's before us. What before us is the issue, is Dennis, Supervisor Mills touched on it, is what we do here today will affect down the line. If we make a decision to allow a subdivision, a lot in a subdivision to be rezoned, we're opening the door to a lot. And that's the situation here that is before us. The subdivision is within itself. All these other lots that are RA or whatever they are surrounding them is irrelevant. They're not part of the subdivision. The subdivision was formed in 1979, and they were RR10s. A year later, they were down to, they came before the board, and several of the owners wanted to subdivide. They were divided down to RR5, and all of the lots were changed to RR5s at that time. You know, I just don't, I can't see, if this lot wasn't within a subdivision, if it was one of the other lots and he came in and he wanted to change the zoning and he wasn't connected any way to any of these other lots to a subdivision, it wouldn't be an issue. It really would not be an issue regardless of anything that he's growing on there, if he's permitted to do so. It's the fact that I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that are listening to what's going on right now on this issue that are part of subdivisions that would stream in here wanting to change to all different types of things, and they could go back and reflect on what we've done here and use it as leverage to us to go with what they want to do. And that's the real problem, is the precedents we're setting here if we allow this to happen, and that's the issue that's before us.
Thank you, Supervisor Tufano. Supervisor Clapp?
I figure, yeah, if the board did this, I'd be the first one down here tomorrow to rezone my property, because I have a 5 acres piece now that has commercial next to it and across the street. So I would rezone my property instantly. And that's not, but I'm in a subdivision. I have 7 other lots in my subdivision. I would rezone my property up in Circle 20s. I have 20 acres there that I was going to put a winery in back in the mid-70s. I would rezone that from RR to RA, because RA is a better zoning. I'm disturbed on the planning department. I was sitting here one time for an hour and a half on what the definition of a batch plan is. There seems to be a lot of work at the planning department to change the definitions of words, and total indifference to communities that are subdivisions, totally. And I'm disturbed by that. I mean, that's the reason I'm sitting here right to this day. I was upset about it, and I ran for office because they were trying to put an asphalt plant in my neighborhood, which is the highest density area in Calaveras County, because of a definition of what a batch plan is. Now, that's disturbing to me. And my whole thing is to preserve our neighborhoods, because if we don't preserve our neighborhoods, we might as well just pack up and leave, because that's the reason I'm here. And so I think you guys pretty much know where my position is.
Further comments? I also have an issue with land use, and I also have an issue with the subdivisions. But that's why we have procedures. Things change. We can't operate with what happened in 1979. We've seen that already in this particular case. And I respect Supervisor Clapp's comments about maintaining the lifestyle that we all thought we had when we moved into this county. things change. Our job is to make sure that we make the best decision for the county as a whole. And when it comes to the rights of the individuals in this county, I pay very close attention to that on both sides of an argument. With that, I would entertain a motion on this agenda item.
Mr. Chair, I would like to make a motion to adopt an ordinance amending the zoning of real property in Calaveras County for rural residential, R5 to residential agriculture, RA for Jed Richardson.
Motion by Supervisor Garamendi. Do I hear a second? I'll second. All in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Indicate by saying no. No. Motion is defeated, 2-3.
Chair, I'd like to make a motion then to deny this zoning change.
Motion by Supervisor Mills to deny the building change, is that correct? Zoning change, okay. Second by Supervisor Clapp. Any public comment? I'll hear your point of order, sir.
I would like to submit this information. This is what I was going to speak to earlier, but I wasn't allowed to use my public comment because apparently cannabis wasn't the issue. These are communications between members of this board, ex parte communications between members of this board with members of the public regarding Jed Richardson's appeal. This is not okay. It is not okay for people of this board to be conversing with Bill McManus about Jed's pending appeal. And these emails clearly indicate that.
Madam Clerk, could you provide that to council, please?
For the record, I just want to clarify, this is not an appeal hearing. This is a legislative hearing for a rezone, just so everyone is clear. As to the motion, I wanted to get clarification on the motion because in the agenda packet, there was an ordinance proposing the approval of the rezone. So if the motion is to deny it, I would just like clarification on directing staff to draft a resolution supporting that denial, and whether you want staff to take a break and do that now, or whether you would direct staff to bring it back at the next board meeting.
Want to take a break
Supervisor
now?
Mills?
I'd prefer to take a break now so we can.
I'm going to poll the board on this. Supervisor Mills, you want to take a break and do it now?
Yes.
Supervisor Clapp?
Yes.
Supervisor Tofinelli?
Yes.
What exactly are we doing? We're trying to amend, we need a motion to not adopt this? And then adopted just got it voted down. Are we being redundant?
No, the motion that is currently in front of the board is to deny the request for the rezone, and there is not a resolution that is drafted based on the record in front of this board that would support the denial at this point. So I would be asking if the board would be directing staff to draft that to accompany this motion.
Hold on a minute, Mr. Fry.
Wouldn't that need to be an
Hold on a
agendized
minute,
item
please.
to have a new item?
It's the same item. It's whether it's to approve or not approve the rezone.
Do you understand, Supervisor?
I do.
Garamendi? I'll hear the first point of order.
I want to understand that the resolution for today was to adopt approval. Is that correct? Okay, so that's the reason why they're requesting the resolution for denial. All right.
That is correct, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. McManus, if you'll take the podium, please. I'll hear your point of order.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, I object to being called out in an open session by another citizen attempting to create some sort of Perry Mason moment when you're getting ready to vote. And what rights do I have to understand this alleged PRA that indicates some sort of improper communication between me and someone else? I have not seen that communication. I am not aware of it. I don't know what supervisor he's talking about. But I think it's improper for my name to be brought up in a board meeting when you're in the process of voting, and for someone to accuse me of something that might buy them some favorable comments from you or actions. So I don't know what legal remedies I have. I don't know how I need to treat this, but I'm outraged that that information was allowed to come out in that manner, and I want to get to the bottom of it and find out what's going on. That's my point of order. Thank you for hearing it.
Your objection is noted. We're not going to discuss this, ladies and gentlemen. If it's a point of order, I'll hear your point of order as far as to the procedure of this board.
Right, exactly.
I don't even want to look at this just yet.
It's to the procedural moment that you're moving forward to. I think there's a little inaccuracy in the residential area that was not referred to. There's no CCNRs for this area that you're putting into, and it was brought up by Mr. Clapp on the right that he wanted to change his and his
Okay,
thing.
all right.
And
Ladies and gentlemen.
there's CCNRs.
Ladies and gentlemen, I will
in
clear
that
this chamber
Rancho
in
Calaveras area
seconds.
that say you cannot do anything other than rural residential.
Mr.
So
Stopper?
it's to the order.
I'll hear your point of order, but it's not going to be an issue for discussion or argument by the gallery.
So it applies to what your new resolution goes towards. You're moving towards doing a resolution to deny on the basis that it's within a community. That community or that subdivision. That subdivision has no CCNRs that say that you cannot change to a different land use. The ones that were brought up by Mr. Clapp in Rancho Calaveras have strictly in their CCNRs that you cannot change to anything other than rural residential. So this is how the law and land use things apply, set before you.
I'd like to set the record correct. He's misleading. I brought 3 incidents up. One was on Country View, which has no CCs and Rs, and that's the one I would bring in for the commercial. So that has no CCs and Rs.
Is that a subdivision?
It sure is. And I'm not going to argue with my vote. I'll vote how I wish to.
Conversation.
Yes, sir.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Stopper. Thank you, Supervisor Clapp. I don't even think we consider that information at this point. We have a motion on the table. The motion is actually made and seconded. Oh, I'm sorry. We took a poll. All right. Okay, we're going to take a 10-minute, 15-minute, 20-minute. Well, let's talk to staff. They're doing it. You got 15 minutes, okay? 15-minute break, folks. Okay, I'll start over. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I think we're ready to proceed, but before we do, I want to make sure everybody understands how we are going to proceed. There will not be any outbursts, nor will there be any one-to-one contact with any board member. If it gets out of order, please be aware I will have this chambers cleared. You can continue hearing from the foyer. If anybody doesn't understand that, let me know now. Thank you. As we left, I understand there is a motion and seconded on the table. Council did respond and initiate a draft of the motion to be heard and voted on. Is there any public comment on the motion?
I'd
No
like
public comment? We'll bring it back.
No public comment.
I'd like to call a point of order.
I'll hear your point of order, sir.
Okay. It's my understanding when additional evidence is presented in a hearing that regarding land use and zoning, that if it wasn't considered previously, then it should, the item being considered should go back to the planning department. And I am respectfully requesting that at this time.
Council, comment?
Are you referring to the appeal process in our code, or and if not, are you, what new evidence are you referring to that needs to be considered by the Planning Commission?
I'm referring to the evidence submitted today by the planning department in the form of this document.
Certainly, that would be in the board's discretion to do. However, considering the Planning Commission recommended approval, any additional information that would be rendered by that for their consideration, their recommendation is approval. So it would either bolster another recommendation for approval or do something which would actually be contrary to the applicant.
Yeah, I'd like to suggest that since the decision was primarily made based on the fact that the land in question here was subdivided in the past, that it needs better, it needs to be considered more within the Planning Commission and by the board possibly because of the future implications of that action of saying that you can never rezone a property which exists in a property that was subdivided, commonly called a subdivision. When many of these properties were subdivided, it was not, they're only called a subdivision because they had to go on a subdivision map. And the rural character was preserved. Decision wasn't necessarily made for high density housing or anything, or the exclusion of agriculture. So I'm afraid that we're setting a precedent here today that's going to affect land use for quite a bit in the future. And I think it bears consideration by further consideration and possibly hearings and discussion on whether this is the precedent that the board should set and the county would like to see. And therefore, I think it bears further investigation by the Planning Commission as to the implications of this decision on future business and future rezoning issues within the county. I am aware of a number of rezoning issues coming up. Subsequent to mine, they're very similar. And obviously, it's something that's going to affect the livelihood of a number of businesses.
Point of order, please.
I'm through.
We'll take your point of order in a moment. Council.
A rezone is a legislative act. The board certainly has discretion if you would like additional input by the Planning Commission as to your decision related to rezoning properties that were within a subdivision map. That is certainly within your discretion. Because it is a legislative action, there is a wide range of discretion that this board has. So I would defer to this board as to whether you would like to solicit additional input and recommendations from the Planning Commission that you didn't feel, if you didn't feel that they considered the first time that this application was submitted to them for their recommendation.
Okay, thank you. I'll hear your point of order.
Mr. Chair, I am absolutely outraged at the proceedings right now. For someone to stand up and raise a point of order and then go on and introduce new testimony, new evidence, without it being challenged, that's not what a point of order is for. It's a procedural matter. Right now, coming up in front of the Planning Commission on Thursday is the first reconsideration. When they pull these tricks and gimmicks to try to get it back to the Planning Commission and start the whole process over again and get another 6 or 8 weeks of time to do whatever they want via a point of order, via new information. It's outrageous that they would do this. And it's outrageous that someone on this board, in charge of the board, will allow that to go on, because that's new information. It's not a procedure. Should have been gone straight to county council for a ruling on all this new information being introduced during a point of order. Thank you.
I would just like to clarify for the record that county council does not make rulings. That is the chair's discretion to make rulings on procedural outcomes and recommendations procedurally, just for the record.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, if I may chime in.
Mr. Mauer?
As Ms. Stedfeld points out, the decision today is a legislative act to rezone property, a wide variety of issues and considerations that need to be looked at when determining whether or not a piece of property is appropriate for a specific zoning. While there are similar situations that could occur in the future, rezoning a piece of property or not rezoning a piece of property does not set a precedent. You have to look at each one individually. And even though another parcel may be within a subdivision, it may be appropriate to rezone it for a variety of reasons unique to that specific location. So you may find in the future, or a future board may find in the future, that it is inappropriate to rezone a property because it is in a subdivision. But the fact that you did not approve this one because it is in a subdivision does not necessarily mean you may not approve some future application. You have to look at each application individually on its merits and decide accordingly. So it is certainly within your discretion to refer this back to the commission if you so desire, but I do not believe that acting on this one today sets a precedent that requires the board to deny all future rezones that happen to be located in the subdivision.
Thank you, sir. I will poll the board and determine what the desire of the board is regarding sending this back.
Before we poll, Chair, there is a motion on the table with a second.
I understand. Okay. But we will deal with that motion first, then we'll have a poll of the board to see if this is going to be sent back to the Planning Commission.
I'm not withdrawing my second.
I'm sorry.
I'm not withdrawing my second.
No one's requesting you to. So, we have a motion on the table. We have a second. We have a draft from council on a resolution.
Did you want me to read the resolution into the record?
Yes.
A resolution denying a zoning amendment 2017-006 from rural residential to residential agriculture for Jed Richardson. Whereas the Planning Department of the County of Calaveras received an application from Jed Richardson requesting a zoning amendment from rural residential to residential agriculture, and whereas the Planning Commission considered the rezone application on May 25th, 2017, and recommended approval of the rezone application, and whereas the Board of Supervisors held a noticed public hearing on July 25th, 2017, which was continued to August 8th, 2017, and again to August 22nd, 2017, in order for the full board to hear the rezone application, and whereas the Board of Supervisors considered all of the evidence and testimony presented during each of the public hearings, including staff reports and a subsequent staff memo, and now therefore be it resolved, the Board of Supervisors hereby denies the zoning amendment 2017-006 based on the following findings. 1, The disapproval of the requested zoning amendment is statutorily exempt from the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA. Evidence. Pursuant to Public Resources Code Section 21080B5, provides a statutory exemption for projects which a public agency rejects or disapproves. Because the Board of Supervisors has rejected the request for a zoning amendment, its action is exempt from CEQA. 2, the rejection of proposed zoning amendment is consistent with the general plan. Evidence, the parcel's current zoning of rural residential is consistent with the parcel's general plan residential center land use designation. 3, the proposed zoning amendment is inconsistent with the character of the area and neighborhood created by the Indian Hills subdivision and runs counter to the manner in which it has been developing over time. Evidence. Since the Indian Hills subdivision was originally approved and recorded in 1979, its density has significantly increased, resulting in an increasingly more residential than commercial character. Initially, the subdivision consisted solely of parcels 10 acres or more in size. A year later, 4 5-acres were approved, and the Board of Supervisors changed the zoning of the entire subdivision from RR10 to RR5, doubling its density and suggesting that the board sought to incentivize residential development in the neighborhood. All parcels originally created by the Indian Hills subdivision and subsequent parcel maps are zoned RR. Changing the zoning of the subject parcel to one that allows more commercial uses of the property runs counter to the county's prior decisions to increase the density and residential character of the neighborhood. These additional uses allowed in an RA zone, which include on-farm sales, more intensive retail trade, and up to 12 special events per year, could draw significantly more commercial activity onto the parcel than exists currently.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Any further questions by the board? No public comment? We have a motion and a second. All in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Say no. No. Motion carries 3-2. Now let's address the point of orders and the planning commission issue. We're going to be polling the board to see if this issue does go back to the planning commission as recommended or stated by Mr. Mauer. Is that correct?
Well, I think it's moot at this point. You've already acted on it, so there'd be no point to referring it back.
It's mute at this point, council? Okay. Madam Clerk, next item, please.
Point of order.
So, I believe, yes, if you say it's moot, but when you previously stated that you would consider by point of order, and now it has not been considered, it's just been dismissed without being considered by the board. So I feel that the decision on whether it should have gone back to the planning commission should have occurred prior to the vote on this.
Chair, I can explain. It was, again, as explained by council, it was a legislative act, and there was no reason to move it back to the planning commission. And it was a motion.
One at a time, gentlemen.
Go ahead.
Microphone. Supervisor Clapp?
Well, first place, there was a motion for a vote, and the only way that could happen, I would have to withdraw my second, and then Supervisor Mills would have to withdraw his motion, and that didn't happen, so we had the vote. So there was that whole process would have happened to do it, and I wasn't going to withdraw my second, so Supervisor Mills didn't have the opportunity to withdraw his. So we had the vote, and the, so it's over. I mean, whatever you do
Right.
now is basically a moot point. I mean, it's not going back to planning.
I'd like to submit that it's not a moot point, it was just a point.
Mr. Richardson, we are not going to discuss law here.
Yeah, it's over.
Okay.
Procedure. I
Okay.
suggest that you get advice, legal advice, and proceed with any type of appeal
Okay.
through the available means.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Madam Clerk?
Item 27 is from the Planning Department to conduct a public hearing and adopt a resolution upholding the Planning Commission's denial of the appeal of the Planning Director's rejection of a commercial cannabis registration for Steve and Renee Snowden on APN 068-003-079, file 2017-046.
Before we start, ladies and gentlemen, I want to go over the procedure for a public hearing. Staff presentation and board question of staff will occur first. Then we'll have a presentation by the applicants, or the appellants, I'm sorry. Presentation by members of the public shall be limited to 5 minutes per person during public comment. Summation and rebuttal by appellants, 15 minutes limit for each appellant. Staff summation and rebuttal. Sir rebuttal by members of the public. Public comment. Board questions. That's to anyone presenting thus far. We're going to close the appeal hearing and a board discussion deliberation with no Q&A from the public. Anybody have a problem understanding that? Let me know now, please. Thank you.
Chair, I just disseminated a notice of motion from the appellant's attorney that was submitted to the clerk during the lunch break.
Madam Clerk, I see this is received August 22nd, timestamped by County Board of Supervisors. Received today?
During the lunch break.
During the lunch break?
Yes.
Thank you. Hearing's open. Mr. Mauer, proceed, please.
So
Excuse
we do have a
Wait a
request for.
minute. Excuse me.
I'm recusing myself on this. I recused I wasn't on the last hearing, so I'm recusing myself.
Excuse me, Mr. Foley's not here, though. And he said he's
Mr.
not
Cole?
representing on this. So where'd the conflict be?
Well, I will recuse myself on the first one.
I understand that, Mr. Clapp, but Mr. Foley was here on the first one.
I understand Mr. Foley's still representing him. To my understanding, I have information. I'm not going to sit there and hear. I don't care what you think. I'm recusing myself.
That is your right.
Okay.
Chair,
Let the record reflect that Supervisor Clapp has recused himself prior to any testimony in the hearing.
Chair, do we need to determine whether or not there's an alternate counsel present for these people?
We'll make
For
that
this appellant?
announcement when it comes time for the appellant to
All right.
speak.
Thank you.
Thank you,
So-
sir.
There is a request for continuance. I recommend that we have a bifurcated hearing, that we consider the request for continuance first, and then should you choose not to grant the continuance, then we get into the presentation on the appeal itself. Mr. Foley presented this letter to you today. I received a copy of it yesterday, and basically states he has a conflict and was unable to be here to represent his clients. The clients the appellant did not have any other representation here today, and they support the request for continuance. I don't have a position one way or the other. We are prepared to move forward with this, but I also understand the need to have adequate representation. I believe that the board has tentatively set a special hearing date for September 19th to consider appeals so that these don't bog down the rest of your agenda, particularly considering we have final budget hearings coming up the first part of September, and this might be an appropriate date to continue this. We also have The other appeals on today's agenda also requested for continuance, and we've got a number of other appeals that are in process right now that we could also schedule for that date. So it would be a appeal palooza, I guess you might say.
Mr. Mauer, do we know the attorney representing items 28, 29, and 30? Is it
Yes, I
also
do know.
Mr. Foley?
It's not Mr. Foley, it's a different attorney.
Okay, thank you. So request been made, or for Mr. Mauer, a request made to bifurcate this?
You may wish to ask the appellants if they have anything to say about the proposed or requested continuance.
Yeah, before we do that, I'm reading what was presented to us. And it seems that he's asking for a delay partially because he wants to introduce new evidence that wasn't part of the planning commission presentation. So that in itself is something that we cannot entertain unless we send it back to the planning commission.
Supervisor Tofinelli, in all due respect, I think we need to address the fact if we're going to bifurcate this. Should we deal with that first? The bifurcation of this, this
Well, I think the
proceeding?
reasons for continuance are germane to the request for continuance. And so Supervisor Toffenelli points out that the reason was he wants to introduce new evidence. Now, you may decide not to accept that new evidence if you continue it and when you get to that hearing. That's a choice that the board can make at that time. Right now, the sole consideration is whether to continue, but obviously the letter presented by Mr. Foley requesting the continuance bears considering as part of your deliberation on continuance.
Counsel, you want to comment on this? Are we going to bifurcate on the continuance request or hear it as a whole agenda item?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question.
Are we going to entertain the request for bifurcation, or are we going to hear the entire matter?
I would recommend, as I've recommended in past hearings, when there's a request for continuance, that it should be bifurcated so that there can actually be consideration on the appeal, or not, excuse me, on the request for continuance. And if the request for continuance is denied, then we would immediately move into the substance of the appeal that's been set for today. If the request for continuance is granted, then we would set it for a future date and move on to the next item.
Okay, thank you, Counsel. So, on the issue of bifurcation, on the continuance, I would agree on the board making a decision whether or not to bifurcate and continue from there. I'll poll the board. Supervisor Mills? Mike, sorry.
No.
Supervisor Tofinelli?
No.
You do not want to bifurcate then? That's my understanding. Is that correct?
No continuance.
Oh, no continuance? Okay.
I would just like to clarify, is the poll on whether to grant the continuance or is the poll to bifurcate the hearing?
I'm addressing the bifurcation of the hearing.
Okay.
All
The
right.
bifurcation of the hearing, not whether you're going to grant the continuance or not.
That's correct. No. Supervisor Tofinelli?
No.
Supervisor Garamendi? No. Supervisor Oliveira? No. Let's deal with the continuance issue. I would poll the board to continue or not to continue with this matter. Any further discussion by the board? County Council, any comment?
Counsel, before you speak, is this considered adequate notice?
There are no requirements within our rules and procedures that require certain timeframes for notice. However, one thing that the board should be aware of is Mr. Foley did file this, I believe it was yesterday or Friday. I did get a copy of it, but this is an amended request. But the original request for consideration was in fact filed and received earlier than today. I do want to remind the board that whenever there is a request for consideration, the board has to consider whether there's essentially whether there's good cause to continue it or not.
We We have an understanding of the issue at hand? Seeing that, I would poll the board. Supervisor Mills on the issue of continuance?
No.
Supervisor Tofinelli?
No.
Supervisor Garamendi?
No.
Supervisor Oliveira votes no. Mr. Mauer, we will continue.
Okay. So this is an appeal of the denial by the Planning Commission of the board's, of the planning director's denial of the, or let me start over again. The planning director's rejection of the acceptance of an application that was submitted or attempted to be submitted after the June 30th deadline of last year. So on April 24th of this year, Mr. and Mrs. Snowden attempted to submit their application for registration on their property off of Skunk Ranch Road in Murphy's area. I sent them a letter saying we could not take in this application because of the deadline that was clearly established through the urgency ordinance, and that's 1795, 165, and 1. It says all commercial medical cultivation site registrants shall submit a complete application for medical cannabis cultivation pursuant to this chapter by June 30th, 2016. Obviously, January or April 24th, 2017 was well beyond that date. In May, the Snowdens appealed that decision to the Planning Commission, and their letter stated that they had been prepared to register, but because Mr. Snowden had been in an accident and was hospitalized, they were unable to complete the registration in a timely manner. As I noted, the application is actually on Vineyard Terrace off of Skunk Ranch and the Penn Gulch area of Murphy's. This is an aerial view of the existing site with the existing cultivation on it. The Planning Commission held a public hearing on June 8th, and the position of the appellants, and they will provide more detail on this, I'm sure, was that they came to the county during the last few days of the registration process. There were a number of people in line. Someone was taking names and phone numbers to call people when they were ready to submit the paperwork, so they didn't have to stand in line. Ms. Snowden believed that they would be called to submit their application, was never called because that was not the process that was in place. It was a miscommunication on her part, and you know, never followed up on it. We were unaware that the cultivation was going on the site until they attempted to submit the application in April of this year. They did follow through on other requirements of the code, submitting, or they didn't submit, but they filled out the application process. They got their notice of applicability and their seller's permit and some of the other requirements. However, because they were not registered, we did not have any of that paperwork in front of us. So the Planning Commission hearing, they determined that the Planning Commission found that they did not submit the registration by the June 30th deadline, that the code clearly requires submittal by that date, and they upheld the decision by me to reject the application. And on June 30th of this year, Mr. Foley, on behalf of the appellants, appealed that determination to this board. That's really all it is. It's really a matter of did they submit their application on time? Were there reasonable circumstances to believe that they could submit at a later date? And did they do a timely, did they follow through in a manner? You know, a lot of discussion at the Planning Commission was, well, you know, if you didn't hear anything from the Planning Department, you know, why did you wait until April to follow through? And their response was that, you know, we'd never heard from them, so we thought everything was okay. So our recommendation is that you uphold the Planning Commission's determination to deny the appeal. Do you have any questions?
Questions of Mr. Mauer?
Yes, I do.
Supervisor Mills?
Mr. Mauer, could you correct the record on what the vote was from the Planning Commission? I've got Mr. Laddish voting both yes and no. in the documents that we have. But I don't see Commissioner Sisk as voting at all. It'd be page 483 of the board packet.
Thank you.
It is not so much that a particular commissioner voted in one direction or another, but to have it showing in this way, it leads to some confusion.
So it appears there's a typo
In the ayes and
resolution.
noes, yeah, on the ayes and noes.
I'm trying to find it. Our page numbering is different, apparently. I can't seem to find it.
You've got the resolution there, Chair? Yeah, right there.
Yeah, but I have it,
Laddish twice, see?
yeah, that's correct.
Just a point.
I may not have the answer to that question.
No, it's just an interesting, not to know which way Commissioner Sisk voted, but that she is not showing on the record is all. If you find the chair's signature, you'll find where I'm talking about.
So it says in the minutes that Commissioner Sisk made the motion to deny the appeal and was seconded by Bocelli. So let's see if I can find the actual resolution.
So that would indicate that the ayes were Bocelli, Laddish, and Mudrides, if she made the motion.
She made the motion to
Okay.
would be Sisk.
Just wanted to correct what we have in front of us.
Okay.
So we have deemed that to be a clerical error?
Yes, and we will correct that in the official record.
Thank you, Mr. Mauer. Any further questions of Mr. Mauer by Board Supervisor Garamendi?
Mr. Mauer, did Mr. Snowden pay the $5,000 application fee?
Well, he attempted to but we did not accept it because we rejected the application.
But prior to June 30th, 2016?
No.
Thank you.
Mr. Mauer? Was that Mr. Stephen O? Not Stephen O, I'm sorry.
No.
And personally? Did he apply submit the application and attempted to pay the fee?
Yes, he did.
Him personally? Do we know?
It was he and his wife. I think they came in together. I don't remember exactly
Okay.
who.
That's
but
what I wanted to
It was
determine.
either he or his wife that came in. I'm pretty sure it was Mr. Snowden.
Thank you. Further questions of Mr. Mauer by the board?
So this denial of this appeal is on behalf of Mrs. Snowden? Is that correct?
It is both Mr. and Mrs. Snowden.
I don't see him on it here anywhere.
The letter of appeal filed by Mr. Foley says this office represents Renee and Steve Snowden, who appealed the Planning Commission decision on June 8th. So it's both.
But was the application not in her name only? The original application that we're dealing with in her name only?
I don't know that we actually have the original application because we rejected it. But yes, you're right, that the application, the attempted filing of the application was for Renee Snowden.
So from our perspective, our appeal is dealing with Mrs. Snowden and Mrs. Snowden only. Unless you're talking marital law and some other things.
The application for the cultivation was in the name of Renee Snowden.
Okay.
The appeal was on behalf of both of them. And
Thank you.
I don't know the nuances and what that means.
Okay.
Counsel, I have a question. Can we hear an appeal of an application submitted by one party and have both parties testify on the appeal? I know we're kind of splitting hairs here, but
Typically, the appellant is the actual applicant, and then anybody who is not the applicant would have any of the same rights as any member of the public to speak on the project. But as far as additional time as an appellant, it's usually the applicant or the person who is actually appealing has a right in that application that is the appellant pursuant to our rules and procedures.
okay. So by that statement, it's my understanding that we can hear testimony by Mr. Stephen Snowden. That's correct? Just want to make sure we get that clarified.
As a member of public, correct?
As a member of the public?
Right.
Or as an appellant?
He's not an applicant, only Ms. Renee Snowden is the applicant. So the applicant is the appellant in this appeal hearing. So the applicant would have the special time frame set out as the appellant, whereas anybody who is not the appellant would be treated just like any other member of the public.
Is the appellant present? Okay, thank you. Ma'am, you can make your presentation.
We had hired legal counsel, so I really didn't prepare a presentation, okay? That's why we had legal counsel. I'm under the impression that once you have your legal counsel, they will take care of everything for you. That's why we paid him, and that's why he was doing the work for us. And he was going to be he was subpoenaing things to bring into the meeting, but they were not available today.
Ms. Snowden, I'm going to ask you to speak louder and into the microphone so we
Okay.
can hear you. I'm catching every other word. I'm
Okay.
sorry.
Mr. Foley has tried to subpoena, okay, Channel 10 News, and there are some people that were at the courthouse that day to register on the 30th. The big issue with the Planning Commission was there was a paper that a uniformed gentleman at the back of the room had on a table it had names and phone numbers of people, and I was told to sign it and they would get back with me. I asked the gentleman how far down the list I was, and he said probably about 200. It was very chaotic. I mean, all the planning people were up in the front of the court with people sitting. There were a couple of gentlemen in the back when you first walked into the courtroom or courthouse that were volunteering to help people get their paperwork together. And they did say that there was a paper that could be signed. When I went in, there were so many people. I figured if I'm 200 on the list, I am not going to be going anywhere today. You know, it's just not going to happen. I did have the cash with me, and I had filled out paperwork that I was going to turn in, but I didn't turn it in because there was nobody. I mean, there was such a long list, there's no way they could have gotten to everybody on that list. So I went home. My husband had started the process originally and was in a motorcycle accident on June 18th. He was in a renowned trauma hospital from June 18th till July 7th. And he was in a trauma coma till about the 4th of July. And I was trying to do this and finish it up with the help of a friend who had registered. But I really was under the impression that day when I signed that paper and put my phone number down that I would be contacted, and I was not contacted. So I had the understanding that I would be considered registered since I had that name, my name on that list on that last day.
Is there anything further you'd like the board to know?
I'm just really sorry this all is such a mess, and there are so many complications, and there have been so many appeals and rejections, and it's just so confusing for everybody. And I'm hoping that all the regulations get straightened out a little bit, and maybe if we try working with rules and such that other states have used and they seem to be working fine, maybe get some input or help from them as to how to deal with it and how to regulate and really watch everything and be able to supervise and be able to get money for our area and for the county and the state to be able to work with, just like the vineyards. There has been pot grown in this county for years. Everybody knows that. And we do work with a doctor who we donate and sell some products to for her Genesis Medical Group. And she is working with getting on the state board to help regulations on this whole issue, because it's just been too confusing for everybody. But as far as the medical end of it, I really don't understand why the government doesn't take it out of that Tier 1 section. But if people would really look at the benefits of it as far as medical, for seizures and for cancer patients, if you knew anybody who had worked with it and dealt with it, you would truly understand. But until I guess you see it for yourself, you don't realize what good it does.
Questions of the appellant, of the board? Supervisor Mills?
Ms. Soden, so you said you signed a list
Yes,
on June 30th?
yes.
And yet you didn't pay the $5,000. Did you ever pay the $5,000?
No, I had it, and Mr. Maurer wasn't going to accept it because it was after the fact, so he didn't want to accept anything at all.
And you did grow last year?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, because really what we're discussing right now is the rules surrounding our urgency ordinance 17.95. and not really the overall merits of cultivation or any other piece of it. It's whether or not the rules that were set forth were complied with. And that's really where our topic of discussion will be today. So,
Right. And that's what it was with the Planning Commission also, because I was there on the 30th with my money, with my paperwork, and I signed that paper and put my phone number down, and I had every thought was that I would be called because I was told I would be contacted. I don't know what you would think about that, but I mean, that I assumed that means I would be contacted and come in with my paperwork.
do you remember about what time of the day it was on that day? Was it later in the day, or?
It was probably between 1 and 2.
Okay. The reason I say that is because I know Supervisor Garamendi and myself were both here in those last hours, right here in front. So we saw what you're talking about.
It was very, very hectic. I
So-
mean, it was so overwhelming. It was
I'm simply
a little
saying,
mind-boggling.
yes, we can put it into perspective because we were
Yeah.
there. Okay, thank you.
Further questions of the appellant by the board? Ms. Snowden, I have a question. What's the estimated investment you have in your grow? Roughly.
I really don't know that I could come up with that figure.
Could it be more than $10,000?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay, with more than 20,000? Yeah, I can't.
Probably.
I'll have-
Probably, yeah.
Could you speak to the microphone, ma'am?
Okay.
Could
Yes.
Could it be more than 30,000?
That's debatable. When you first start out, yeah, you have a very large investment, but each year you update things and
I understand.
rework things, and so
Do you operate your grow by yourselves, or do you have any help?
we have a couple that helps us.
Okay, are
There's
they
no way
laborers
we could
or
do that.
managers, or what's exactly their roles?
I just call him my master gardener, and him and his wife work with us. And I mean, there's no way my husband and I could do that because he is not physically able with stage 4 cancer and such to do anything like that. And I can't either. So they pretty much work with everything.
What was the date of your husband's motorcycle accident?
June 18th,
June 18th?
yes.
Thank you. Any further questions?
Ms. Snowden, I'm really sorry about the motorcycle accident and the stage 4 cancer. It's got to be a real burden on you, and my heart goes out to you. And I am pretty impressed you were able to make it by the 30th of June, having had that accident
It
on
was
June
not
18th.
easy,
I
but
understand
yeah.
that it's crazy. I hope, you understand that, I understand that you guys had this and your whole life got turned upside down very suddenly. But a year later is a long time, almost a year. Did you have any, I don't want to ask what you're thinking because you're trying to keep your family together, I'm sure, this last fall, but did it bother you that no one ever followed up?
It really didn't. There were a lot of things going on, okay? We had a lot of complications after the accident, and he's had a few surgeries and things, and so he's had, then he ended up with like an E. coli infection, which was
Ma'am, you don't do
ridiculous.
anything.
I mean, it's just there were a lot of things that we were going through, and no, it was not number one priority in my head. Okay, it wasn't.
I understand.
Further questions? Ms. Snowden, I can sympathize with the motorcycle accidents. I was in the same situation a long time ago, spending 4 months in the hospital due to a motorcycle accident. While you were attending to your husband's needs in the hospital, did you have anybody actually maintain your grow, or were they able?
The couple that we have working with us, yes, they were there at our property. And that's how I could go back and forth to Reno and work with the doctors and stuff, so,
All right. Did they also assist in the harvest?
yes,
Were you able to assist in the harvest?
no.
Okay. Any further comments you'd like to make?
Just that I'm really sorry because I really had no intention of being up here today because we have Foley and this was not something I'm prepared for and I was not ready for.
You'll have an opportunity for any rebuttal as soon as we go through the summation.
I do have one question.
Okay, go ahead, Supervisor Mills.
Thank you, Chair. Was your application that you turned in, what date was that signed? Maybe that's a question for staff.
Peter has
Maybe
it.
they have
Well,
a
no.
copy of it there.
The planning, when I was at the planning commission, they took copies of a bunch of stuff. I think Peter has a copy of it there. It was in the package.
The application itself was signed on May 27th, 2016.
So we're talking about an application was signed May 27th and turned in on June 30th? Did we receive that application?
No, because I signed the papers, but I didn't, there was nobody to turn anything into.
Okay,
The-
all right.
the
That's
whole
what I just,
planning.
I was
Yeah.
looking for clarity on that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Snowden.
I also had the, what was it, the deed, the water paperwork, the seller's permit. I mean, yeah, I had everything together. I was just not able to turn it in.
Thank you. You can have a seat if you'd like. We'll be calling you back up for rebuttal.
Thank you.
I'd like to go back to Mr. Mauer. Mr. Mauer, do you keep copies of the sign-in sheets that they had during that period?
I do not believe that we kept a copy of that. Once we had gone through, we had crossed out the names of everyone. We tried to track that down previously before the Planning Commission hearing and could not find the sign-in sheet that we had. So it's unfortunate that we do not have that in our records. As everyone said, it was pretty chaotic during that time. We tried to do the best we could to keep everything straight. But we do not have a copy of that sign-in sheet.
Okay, Mr. Mauer, do you have a copy of any sign-in sheets prior to that date? Were you able to locate any of those?
No.
Were you able to locate any sign-in sheets after that date, if there are any?
We didn't have any sign-in sheets after that
So
date.
we don't have any documented
So the last
evidence.
couple days of the registration process, when we were, literally flooded with hundreds of people standing in line, and we realized we could not process all those during those last couple of days, and so we started a sign-in sheet, or we developed a sign-in sheet where people would, if we saw that they had their paperwork, we would write down their names and call them. And I cannot say with certain that they were on or not on that list because we unfortunately did not keep a copy of that after we were done with the receipt of all the other applications that came in. It took us about 2 weeks to finish the acceptance of all those applications, but only from the people that were on that list. So I suppose it's possible that we might have missed someone on that list, but I'm sure that we were very careful to make sure that anyone that was on that list was contacted to follow up and come in with their application. I just can't say with certainty one way or the other on that.
Okay. Well, what was the procedure for the follow-up phone calls? Was that done by your staff?
Yes.
And was there any documentation of the results of that follow-up attempt? A notation on an application or a notation on any type of document that we may still have?
There were a number of notations we made on the sign-up sheets that, when we contacted them, whether they, in many cases, we had to leave a message. Did they contact us back? Were there a number of, back and forth calls of, and we essentially say, you're next on the list, please come in on this date at this time. In some cases, in most cases, they did show up at the appointed time. In some cases, they would call back and say, I can't do it. I got some conflict. Can I come in the following day? And to the degree that we could accommodate that, but we were trying to stick to the schedule as best we could.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Sure.
I have a question, Mr. Mallon.
Go ahead, Supervisor Tofinelli.
I'm on our packet page 523.
Yes.
And that, this is a copy of the application?
My page 523 is just the last page of a letter from the water board.
I'm looking at, Dennis, do you have 523 as a copy of?
The computer died.
I breathed.
Does that not say 523?
523, yeah.
Well, it looks like it's an application filled out by Renee Snowden.
I do have that.
Yes, for whatever reason, my page starts on page 517.
Okay, so you have that?
Yes.
Okay, so you have it up. When did you receive this?
This is what they submitted as a part of their appeal package when they appealed it in May. This is what they attempted to submit in April, and I said, I'm sorry, I can't accept it. And apparently they also tried to submit it back in June of 2016.
So you never received this, you turned it away, said I won't.
Yes.
And so it ended up in a package that they put together for their appeal.
Yes.
Okay, all right. Okay. I thought it might be something that you took and it didn't have a date stamp on it. That's, so.
Ma'am, please come to the podium. We'll give you the opportunity.
We didn't put it in the package. When we were at the Planning Commission, the lady commissioner asked if I had any copies of my paperwork, if I had copies of the application or the seller's permit or the water board. So I turned them over to this young lady and she passed them around, and then there were copies made after that meeting and put in place.
Okay. So
it wasn't in the packet, it was at the meeting that they got them.
Okay. So it was additional evidence than you had produced and gave to her? Okay.
Yeah, per their request. She wanted to see if I had everything in place for that date, and I said, yes, I did, and so they wanted to see proof of that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Chair, just a quick point of order. I wanted to, scrolling through the agenda item, I wanted to get some clarification. because looking at the agenda item for the Planning Commission, it identifies Steve Snowden as the appellant and applicant. The actual applicant has Renee Snowden on it rather than both. And so when I indicated the appellant, or the applicant is typically the appellant, I do not know if at the Planning Commission both Mr. and Mrs. Snowden were considered applicants or appellants during that hearing or not. And I bring this up purely because under 179807O, standing to file an appeal is for any project proponent or aggrieved party that may file an appeal, provided that the appellant has participated in the administrative process prior to filing an appeal. So if Mr. Snowden did in fact participate at the Planning Commission level as an appellant, based on the information that is here in front of me, I would recommend that this board also treat him and not just Ms. Snowden as an appellant.
Thank you, Counsel.
In a letter that is in our packet, sent by Mr. Maurer, it was to Mr. Snowden, saying that you appealed. It says, "Dear Mr. Son," my page 488, and it's stamped, well, the date on was April 26th. It says, "Dear Mr. Snowden, on April 24th, you tried to submit a commercial cannabis cultivation registration application for your property." So it was addressing Mr. Snowden as the applicant here too, so.
At the
And
time-
if we never received actually the application, you turned it away, so there wasn't really an applicant, so the appeal would be.
This is an appeal of a staff decision, and the staff decision under review is the rejection of the application, the refusal to accept it. That's the staff decision that is being appealed, and any interested party can appeal it. But I think the question that you
Correct, but
have
the-
is that I've been dealing with both Mr. and Mrs. Snowden,
Yeah.
sort of interchangeably. And some of the correspondence has been to both of them, some has been individual, and Mr. Snowden has been my primary contact. I wasn't really aware of the fact that the registration itself was in just Renee's name, because I've been dealing with both of them together. And both of them together appealed the Planning Commission's decision.
Yeah, we should have said that at the beginning, so Mr. Snowden does have an opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Supervisor Tofinelli. So, Counsel,
And just for the record, I don't know if the board is aware or not, but the application is in fact part of this agenda item. It's attached as D in your, it's on page 523 of your board packet.
So, Counsel, I have a question. During the purposes of this hearing, can we consider Mr. Snowden an appellant?
Under the circumstances and based on the information in this record, I would recommend that you consider him an appellant as well as Ms. Snowden.
Thank you. Mr. Snowden, are you available? You there? Do you understand? Could I have you come to the podium, sir? Mr. Snowden, I want to make sure you understand that you have the right to speak as an appellant in this proceeding, along with your wife, Mrs. Snowden.
Thank you.
You have a joint
Yeah.
spokesperson status, if you will.
I was there mostly for support. I did start the, the application process before the motorcycle accident, and I was left with some cognizance impairment, and with my condition at stage 4 level with a cancer, I just figured that you never know. So I put it in her name, and that's why we did it for the application. But as it turned out, she's not that involved in the whole procedure. I wasn't involved, and then she got left in the dark, and a friend helped her while I couldn't. And we went through the Planning Commission, and I found it, I don't know if any of you watched the video of it, because it's pretty intense. And at the very end, Madam Chair says, gee, it's too bad you don't have any evidence that you were actually there that day rather than taking care of your husband, like you should or something. So that's the way I took it. And she says, do you have any evidence that you were there that actually in this area here and not being in Reno with your husband? And almost in the same sentence, she says, well, let's take a vote on it. It's too bad you don't, but you know, if you could present that evidence, then maybe we would consider it, because she was almost basically saying that my wife wasn't telling the truth by even being there. And that you remember that came up, and it was odd to me, and because it was very important to us. And the fact that it didn't get put, that we waited till April was that the main issue was that she wasn't maybe in line or didn't sign a list, even though she's never lied in her life to me as far as I know. And so, I mean, they even asked her if she had a friend there, and she could have said yeah, but she didn't. She was there, and she was, and a friend that helped her knew she was there to be there, but that was never entered. And then Mr. Foley found a video of Channel 10 of that day that was there with the newscaster that he wanted to submit to help that, because that was basically the issue we were dealing with on this. And I guess we didn't get to do that. So I'm here to say that we had every intention. I had multiple doctor appointments, multiple problems. I'm still not sure about my cognizance skills, whatever they are. But I know that I have a hard time thinking, and it's, you know, I'm usually better at multitasking and presenting a case than I am now. And I feel that, you know, we've talked about the lot split, and that's why Mr. Maurer and I had a lot of communication, because it was both this and that, and me asking him, is the marijuana growing part of the reason that it's taking so much time? And we ended up actually getting our biological study and all the things that they're going to require basically in the coming years. And if you see the picture, we tried to be a model garden. We've got an excellent crew that helps us, and they're a couple. And they do most of the work, because I broke 7 thoracic vertebrae and the ribs came detached in my accident, as well as a head injury. And so I really can't, you know, bend over for it. I can't do the labor. So we're highly dependent upon them. And more than anything, you know, I hate to disappoint him by saying that we screwed up. And I don't know that we really did screw up, because we, honest to God, tried. And my wife was just under too much pressure, and maybe she misunderstood the line. But from what I was told, that there was the place to sign in here, but the line that she was in extended way outside into the courtyard. And that's where another officer evidently was there taking names and numbers. And so that made sense, you know, a telephone number with your name, not just your name. And Mr. Maurer said that the packets that were turned in, when you got that far, some of the numbers, some people didn't even put their telephone number on them, and some of the numbers were not the right numbers, and he had trouble even processing them. So if we'd have known, or if we could, I think if she could have gotten that far through the crowd, but you know, no butsies, you know, no, you can't butt in front of people and stuff like that. So she was just standing in line, and finally when this list came around, is what I understand, she signed it and was firmly believed that they would call her. And had I not had complication after complication with cancer and other things, which I could even bring the records of that if necessary. But nevertheless, it was just a rough time for us, and it wasn't from me too busy working at Harvest. I couldn't. I wasn't too busy doing work around the place. I couldn't. It was strictly that we figured they'd call us, and then time gets away from you, as you know, especially the older you get. And when we were dealing with the lot split, I was trying to deal with that as well, and go through those hoops, and I have pretty much. And when I was talking to Mr. Maurer about that, like the meeting we had with you and Mr. Maurer, at another time I asked him about it. I said, is this because we're growing marijuana that it's so problematic? And he says, absolutely not. And I said, well, good. I don't know what else I can add, because I was unfortunately hurt pretty bad and unconscious for that long, and that was during. If I'd have done it sometime between, I don't know when they started accepting the applications, but the accident was 18th, and it was over by the time I woke up. So I really couldn't, and that's why my wife took over for me.
Thank you, Mr. Snowden.
Okay, thank you.
Board, I have to make a disclosure that Mr. Snowden and I did meet with Mr. Maurer regarding a land split. And at that time, we did not discuss anything regarding any application or any appeal. But that was prior to, I think that was last year at times. Okay? Is there anything else the Snowdens would like to present before we go to our summation? Oh, that's right, public comment.
Can I say one more thing? I didn't intend to imply that we talked about marijuana at that meeting. Okay.
Not necessary, sir. I just want to make sure that we're all clear. All right, public comment, please. You'll have 5 minutes per person.
I can tell this is paining everybody here. I can really tell. We all like Mr. Snowden. We understand his situation. And do you remember your Thomas Aquinas? Thomas Aquinas?
I can barely hear you.
Your Latin? You remember your Latin?
I know, I was never good at that.
Oh, okay. Okay. Fear of the man of one book. Disraeli would say it again in the 1800s is beware of the man of one book. And that means when you don't take everything into consideration, when you don't have a full breadth of knowledge or something, you tend to make mistakes, and those mistakes can be less than advantageous to people. It would be homo unius libre, or hominium unius libri timeo, fear of the man of one book. Well, that's the situation we have here, is we have a flawed book. We have a urgency ordinance that from its inception to its practice has been flawed in many ways, and been continued and been changed and been interpreted differently. And we're expecting somebody
Mr.
to...
Slaughter, I'm sorry.
Okay, yeah, and we're expecting...
I can't understand you.
I'm really sorry. This is my voice, and this is what you're going to get.
Can we speak louder or get closer?
Probably not.
I can't hear a word you're
understand
saying.
that this is my voice, and the way you project yourself and the way you make yourself understood sometimes is the way you speak. Okay.
Okay, so
Now,
you can continue, but
yes, I
stay
will.
on topic.
I will. I am continuing on topic here. As Mr. Lutz knows about the voice and the way you speak. That we're expecting people to obey an ordinance that is flawed, and the way they submit it may be flawed as well. In the Planning Commission, when we heard this, it was a vote of 2-3 with two of our two great attorneys. I know them as attorneys, and they're quite well, arguing on Mr. Snowden's behalf, who are sitting on the Planning Commission. So that is one of the problems I have with what we're doing here. And I'm going to respect your decision. I always do. I think we can move along. You remember a Dutch lens grinder. His name was, what was his name? Dutch lens grinder Spinoza. He would say, and a philosopher, he would say that no man can be denied posthumous honors until all has been said in his behalf. He didn't allow his attorney to be here. His attorney can say all on his behalf. People have a tendency to not be able to put things in order for themselves. As is a doctor is his worst patient. We know this. So by not having his attorney here, we're not able to fully vet this and make a decision. I ask you I ask you to make a decision based on what's right and wrong, not necessarily what's by the book. And I know that's very difficult for you to do. We do it in the Planning Commission. We do it in the Planning Commission because we are different. We are more maybe we take things into consideration. It's not to speak ill of you of any way. There's a greater breadth of knowledge in land use issues. You have to cover a multitude of issues here. So we look at things differently, and we take everything into consideration. If county council probably remembers Clarence Darrow as saying that we determine what's right and wrong, and then we find the law to back it up. And here you have to determine what's right and wrong and find the rules to back it up and find a way to interpret those rules to back it up. So I'm disappointed that Ken couldn't be here. I know exactly what the case is that he's handling. I know the people involved. But believe me, there's a reason he couldn't be here. And, in a short time, from the Planning Commission to here, I've gotten to know the Stodens, and I trust them immensely. I trust them as growers. They're able to provide from plant to patient with an unbroken chain their product. And even though it's marijuana, we can't deny a man posthumous honors until all has been said in his behalf. So I'd urge you to find some way to bring it to bring Ken back into the room and have him defend him, because I know that they were here. Well, I saw you two here, yes, because I was over there. I used to walk around at this campus.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Bill Wilson, District 1. We all know that. Anyway, Mr. Snowden, Ms. Snowden was or maybe wasn't there that day. Who knows? There were 300-400 people standing in line, signing up lists. There were 2 or 3 different lists going around. We've all testified to that. We've all seen that. I was one of the people that was helping people get their packets together. I wish I could say I saw Mrs. Snowden there. I can't do that. If I could, I'd be there. I would have been there in the planning department. I was at their hearing. She had a husband that was in the hospital. Why didn't it get done before that? I don't know. Why did 300 people wait until June 30th? Maybe because they thought this county would pull the rug right out from underneath them after they gave them their $5,000. Maybe they figured this county turned around and tried to ban it right after they tried to regulate it. Maybe they say, I don't know, I don't trust anybody. Coming out of the closet's a scary thing. I'm a commercial cannabis grower. That's a scary proposition in this state right now. It's a scary proposition in this county. We still don't have regulation, and we're at a second harvest under the UO, and we can't transport. Where are we supposed to take this stuff when it's done? We have to have somebody break the law, come into this county to collect the product, to take it somewhere to a dispensary, or we could get in trouble just taking it from our farm to the dispensaries locally here, because we don't have transportation. Mr. Snowden and his wife filled out the business application, filled out the application. She put her name on a list. She expected to get called. She had the $5,000. What is wrong with the application other than it didn't get submitted, but we make arrangements for people to come in and turn those applications in, but we don't save that list. We make an appointment for somebody to come in and give us that money, turn in their application after the deadline. But because their name either didn't get crossed off on the list, they called, she was in Reno, somebody didn't give somebody the message, maybe it was on the list, maybe it wasn't on the list. We don't know. We didn't have the list. We didn't keep the list. I'm a computer tech. You make a list, you put a scanner, you scan it, you put it in a file. I don't care. You don't throw it in the trash can after you checked everybody's name off the list. Now, we've rejected people, this board's rejected people for no business license when they didn't need one, for no BOE permit when you can't sell retail. We've rejected people because, I don't know, they didn't have a picture of their property. These people have been growing for years. Everybody knows they've been growing for years. They're members of this community that have been in this business for years. They didn't get their application in on time. Shame on them. We should reject them, right? Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Good evening, Board. I don't know quite how to get my arms around this one. We got about three things going on at the same time here. First of all, if you don't submit an application, or you try to submit an application and you can't because it's a year later, you know, that's not really a close call, especially if you have $20,000 or $30,000 involved in it. And they decide not to take your application money, and then you want protection under the ordinance that you don't belong under because you didn't join the system. By not being there in time on the 30th, you can't join the crew that's operating under 1975. Now you're out in the crews that are just growing wild. The pirates, the illegals, whatever. You don't have any protection. You don't have any standing in 1795. You know, why is it even here? Why are we wasting this much time? The second thing is we see it starting to unwind these proceedings as different gambits are used with attorneys not showing up, with new evidence going to be presented, with let's go back and start over at the Planning Commission. So far, no one has asked to go all the way back to May 10th and start over again. Wouldn't be surprised if that happened. Anything to continue the growing season, game the system, and then they don't have to worry about it. So I guess I just don't understand why the system gets wound up like this. It seems like they're leading the county around, they're leading the Board of Supervisors around, they're leading the Planning Commission around, they're leading the Planning Department around, and no one seems to have a firm grip on this thing to say, no, you were late, you don't belong here, you have no standing, go away. And we don't care who your attorney is, we don't care how much money you had or where you put it, or what list you may or may not have been on. None of that is known. Certain things are known. Was not turned in time, shouldn't be here, that should be the end of it. And we should be going on to handle the other ones that at least got their application in within a year of the application date. I think that's a good start for the other ones. Thank you.
Further public comment?
Hello, Board. Trevor Whitkey, Calaveras Cannabis Alliance, District 2. It's very unfortunate that the Snowdens were unable to get their application in as a result of the circumstances that arose around that time. They very clearly took steps and efforts to try and fill out an application, to submit an application prior to the June 30th deadline. I too, like Bill Wilson, was here helping people fill out their applications during the last week of submittal. It was very chaotic. There were lots of people here waiting in line. It was unclear where the line began and where the line ended. Differences occurred in the way that things were being, the way that staff was dealing with the applications. At a certain point, the applications were taken and they were put into a box. At a point after that, a receipt started to be given. That was a variation in the procedure. It's very possible when procedures are being made in spontaneously on the spot to deal with the circumstances that are arising, that mistakes can be made. Not for any bad intention or any failings of anybody involved in the process, but simply because mistakes get made. A list could have been created. Mrs. Snowden could have put her name on said list. I believe her because of all of the other steps that they took prior to that date indicating their intent to submit their application. I don't think that they are liars when they come up here and say that they intended and were trying to do their best effort. I also know that it took a very, very long time for applications to get processed. Mine's still pending. I gave the sheriff's office my background check on September 17th. It is still pending almost a year later. I've been waiting for a year for a call back from the sheriff's office. I've inquired a number of times over the last year, checking on the status. My life's also a lot less complicated. I'm not dealing with stage 4 cancer. I'm not recovering from a very traumatic motorcycle injury. There are reasons why people are unable to make these deadlines. There are reasons why mistakes get made. And instead of treating everybody like a criminal, instead of looking at everybody as if they're liars or trying to game the system, we can have good faith and we can believe in our community and the other members of our community and take their statements at face value without being punitive. And I believe that this is a case in which that type of belief in one another is important. The Snowdens are not trying to game the system. They're longtime members of this community who have lived here longer than I have and longer than many other people who have been processed through this system. There's no reason to treat them as if they are being deceitful, lying, or otherwise trying to undermine our simple processes of legal administration of these applications. So I would encourage the board to take their statements at face value, weigh them, and consider the issues that are before the board with a certain degree of good faith, because I really don't believe that any display of bad faith has been made by the applicants. They have clearly tried to submit their application within the time frame. Circumstances arose that made it so that their application was not submitted, but that was not because of anything intentional on their part. Furthermore, I would also say that it's unfortunate that Ken Foley is unable to be here. I do think that Ken Foley would be able to provide a very persuasive case and would be able to better elucidate these issues because he has prepared their case, and that given the circumstances, putting the Snowdens on the spot, making them come up and defend this appeal when they're ill-prepared to do so because they're relying on counsel, prejudices their appeal, and the board should consider that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jason Campbell, District 5. I have a few comments and concerns here. One is, I also believe that the Snowdens are not lying. I think the things that we need to take into consideration here is they have an application that was filled out and signed on May 27th. They also acquired an NOA through the Regional Water Quality Control Board. They did their Board of Equalization. They did a few other things that I can't pull off the top of my head right now that were requirements that they all did. There was medical circumstances to take into consideration, but the main thing I think we need to take into consideration here is there's some major discrepancies in procedure, I understand rules are rules, turn your application in by the 30th, but if she was here on the 30th and there was a list going around, I got a major problem with not having that list still. Where is it? Why can't it be produced? If you were taking that list and taking numbers, it should have been in a file. So based on that alone, what's the harm in taking their application, processing it, see if there's another reason for denial? There probably isn't. The farm looks really nice. They're gonna pay taxes. That's my question. What's the harm in taking their application and processing it?
Thank you.
The harm is that marijuana is a lie.
Thank you.
Good evening, Board. Just a couple simple things. Back to the idea of the burden of proof being on the accuser is one of them. And I know for a fact that these lists were, I wasn't on one of them, but I know a lot of people that were. Planning was overwhelmed with applicants. And they know there was lists. They know they exist. And we could produce a lot of other people to verify that as well. And if I was representing the county, I would like to take responsibility for the organization I'm representing and hold myself to the higher standard rather than just holding other people to it. And lastly, just to point out, in addition to what Jason just said about what's the harm in processing the application, just to add on to that, especially in light of the fact of there's a whole hell of a lot of applications still in process anyway. And that's all I'll say for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more public speakers on this issue?
George Fry. I think that the planning department was overwhelmed. I'm sure that Mr. Mauer and his staff didn't intentionally throw away the list. Obviously, they should have hung on to them. I don't think that the Snowdens should be penalized. If Mrs. Snowden came in and signed up on the list and put her phone number down, I believe that she was waiting for the phone call. What happened between the time that she signed up, put the phone number down, and now, I think there's only one person that knows, and that's God. I hope you give serious consideration to the Snowden's appeal. Thank you.
Very nervous.
It's okay.
My name is Rich Smith, and I am Steve and Renee's neighbor. And I care a lot for Steve and Renee, and I know that they've had quite a few years of issues with the county and being able to do with their property and so forth. But Steve's pretty good for just doing things on his own without, talking with the neighbors and getting some approval. I moved out across the street from Steve, and I've done everything I can to improve the property. We have quite a bit of money in our property. Our road is a private road. It's not a county-maintained road. We had to sue the county to get it paved. And I guess the main thing I had a problem with is there was a lot of traffic, and just I think Steve was doing things he shouldn't have been doing. I hope that some of that has gotten straightened out. I find that a lot of people come up here and find a lot of excuses for, I sympathize with Steve's issues and so forth. I've had quite a few of mine over the last few years too. But, you know, the burden is on us. There's nobody in here that is, 12, 14 years old. We're adults. And when I built my house, I came and brought my plans down to the department. I turned them in, and I didn't walk away, and just thought, well, they'll give me a call. I followed up with it. I did everything I needed to do. If I was to get water tests, I did that. I took care of it. I followed through. And I just don't see how you can come to this county with something as important as a business license and turning it into a business that might change your life and walk away and not do much about it. There's plenty of time to get this paperwork in, not wait until almost a year later. So I just, boy, I just wish you guys the best in deciding this thing, because I feel I have a lot to lose. I feel like I will take a hit in my investment in my property, because I'm just ready to leave this county. I don't feel that this county represents the nice rural areas. I moved here from the Bay Area to get away from all of the hubbub, and like I say, invested a lot of money in this property and other properties here in the county. But I just don't agree with all this unrest, and I'm ready to call it quits and move on. But I realize that financially that is going to be a hit that I'm going to have to take. And I know other people are doing it right now. Other people are taking a hit and they're leaving. So you guys really need to get it together and be consistent. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Any future public comment? Seeing none, at the request of our staff, we're going to be taking a 10-minute break. We'll reconvene in 10 minutes.